The Fall of Constantinople, 1453. The screams echoed across the ancient walls as the first light of dawn revealed the horror unfolding. Ottoman troops poured through the breached defenses like a relentless tide, their curved swords glinting in the morning sun. After 53 days of desperate resistance, the unthinkable was happening. Constantinople, the magnificent capital that had withstood siege after siege for over 1,000 years, was falling. Inside the majestic Hagia Sophia, Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos removed his imperial regalia. "The city is fallen, but I am still alive," he reportedly declared before plunging into the final battle, never to be seen again. By mid-morning on May 29th, 1453, Sultan Mehmed II rode triumphantly through the streets of what would soon become Istanbul. As he entered the Hagia Sophia, now emptied of its Christian defenders, he bowed toward Mecca and ordered the cathedral converted into a mosque. This moment marked not just the end of the Byzantine Empire, the last vestige of ancient Rome, but a pivotal turning point between medieval and modern history. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves across Europe, accelerated the Renaissance, diverted trade routes, and helped shape the world we know today. To understand the fall, we must first understand what was lost. Constantinople wasn't just any city. It was a living museum of classical civilization, a direct link to the Roman Empire that had collapsed in the West 1,000 years earlier. While Western Europe had fragmented into feudal kingdoms after Rome's fall in 476 CAE, the Eastern Roman Empire, which we now call Byzantine, had preserved Greco-Roman knowledge, law, and culture. At its height under Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, the Byzantine Empire controlled most of the Mediterranean coastline, including Italy, North Africa, and the Levant. Its capital, Constantinople, was the largest and wealthiest city in Christendom, with perhaps 500,000 inhabitants. Protected by its massive triple walls and the natural moat of the Bosphorus Strait, the city was considered impregnable. But by 1453, this once mighty empire had withered to a shadow of its former self. The disastrous Fourth Crusade of 1204, when Western Christian crusaders sacked Constantinople instead of fighting Muslims in the Holy Land, had dealt a blow from which the empire never fully recovered. Though Byzantine emperors reclaimed their capital in 1261, the empire now consisted of little more than the city itself and scattered territories in Greece and Anatolia. Emperor Constantine XI ruled over barely 50,000 subjects. The once gleaming city was filled with abandoned buildings and empty quarters, its population decimated by plague and economic decline. Many of its marble facades had been stripped and sold to keep the imperial treasury afloat. The famous Theodosian walls, though still formidable, had fallen into disrepair due to lack of funds for proper maintenance. Meanwhile, a new power had risen, the Ottoman Turks. Originally nomadic warriors from Central Asia, they had converted to Islam and steadily conquered Byzantine territory in Anatolia. By 1453, they controlled most of the Balkans and had surrounded Constantinople, choking the once great city into a besieged island in an Ottoman sea. Sultan Mehmed II was just 21 years old when he resolved to accomplish what his predecessors had failed to do: capture Constantinople and extinguish the last ember of the Roman Empire. Unlike previous Ottoman rulers who had been content to keep the weakened Byzantine state as a tributary, Mehmed was driven by both strategic calculation and historical ambition. Either I will take Constantinople, or Constantinople will take me, he reportedly declared, understanding that capturing the city would cement his place in history alongside Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. Mehmed was an intellectual, as well as a warrior. Fluent in several languages, including Greek, he studied classical history and the accounts of previous sieges of Constantinople. He understood both the city's weaknesses and why past attempts to capture it had failed. Breaking with his predecessors, he didn't underestimate the challenge. He prepared methodically. The young sultan's first act was to secure his eastern borders through treaties, ensuring he wouldn't face a two-front war. His second was to build a fortress, Rumeli Hisara, on the European side of the Bosphorus Strait, directly across from an existing Ottoman fortress on the Asian side. This allowed him to control the strait completely, cutting off Constantinople from potential help from Genoese or Venetian colonies in the Black Sea. Most importantly, Mehmed invested in artillery. He hired an engineer named Urban, a Hungarian or Croatian Christian who had first offered his services to Emperor Constantine, but was turned away due to lack of funds. Urban designed for Mehmed a series of massive cannons, including one monster that could fire stone balls weighing up to 1,200 pounds. The largest cannon was so enormous that it took 60 oxen to transport it, and its blast could reportedly be heard 25 miles away. Emperor Constantine XI was under no illusions about the gravity of his situation. He sent desperate appeals for help to Western Europe, even agreeing to church union between the Orthodox and Catholic faiths. A deeply unpopular move among his subjects, who remembered the Fourth Crusade all too well. Many Byzantines preferred the Sultan's turban to the cardinal's hat, as one official reportedly put it. Despite religious tensions, Constantine managed to rally the city's defenders. The population may have been small, but it included some of the finest soldiers in Christendom. About 7,000 men manned the walls, including a contingent of Genoese professional soldiers led by Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, an experienced commander. The Byzantine navy consisted of just 26 ships, but they were supplemented by Venetian, Genoese, and other European vessels that happened to be in the harbor when the siege began. Constantine ordered the massive chain boom across the Golden Horn Inlet raised, preventing Ottoman ships from entering this natural harbor on the city's northern flank. He also ordered all available food brought inside the walls and rationed. The emperor knew they could not match Ottoman numbers, estimated at around 80,000 soldiers. But he hoped to hold out until either Western reinforcements arrived or the Ottoman army was forced to withdraw due to disease or supply problems. As had happened in previous sieges, the mood inside the city was a mixture of fatalism and determined resistance. Many saw the coming battle in apocalyptic terms. Ancient prophecies stated that Constantinople would fall when the emperor's name was Constantine, as the founder of the city had been, and when the moon was waning. Both conditions were now met. The night before the final assault, a strange red glow was observed around the dome of the Hagia Sophia, interpreted by many as the Holy Spirit departing from the church. Yet rather than surrendering, the population joined in a final religious procession, carrying icons through the streets before attending one last service in the great cathedral. On April 2nd, 1453, the Ottoman army appeared before Constantinople's walls. For several days, Mehmed simply positioned his forces, establishing camps and artillery positions. The main Ottoman army faced the Theodosian land walls to the west, while smaller forces guarded the sea walls along the Marmara and Bosphorus coasts. The first Ottoman cannons began firing on April 6th. Their impact was immediate and terrifying. Never before had Constantinople's defenders faced such destructive power. Sections of the outer wall began to crumble under the continuous bombardment. The Byzantines worked frantically each night to repair the damage, using anything available: wooden beams, barrels filled with earth, cotton bales, and even bedding. Mehmed attempted his first major assault on April 18th, but it was repulsed with heavy Ottoman casualties. The Sultan then tried to tunnel under the walls, but Byzantine engineers detected the vibrations and dug countermines, flooding the Ottoman tunnels or suffocating their sappers with smoke. The most dramatic moment of the early siege came on April 22nd, when an Ottoman attempt to capture the chain across the Golden Horn failed. In response, Mehmed implemented an audacious plan. Overnight, his men constructed a road of greased logs across the hills behind Galata, the Genoese colony across the Golden Horn, then dragged about 70 ships overland from the Bosphorus to the inland portion of the Golden Horn, bypassing the chain boom completely. The sight of Ottoman ships appearing behind their defenses shocked the Byzantines and stretched their limited manpower even thinner, as they now had to defend the sea walls along the Golden Horn as well. A Byzantine attempt to attack these ships with fire ships on the night of April 28th was betrayed by informants and failed disastrously. By mid-May, the situation inside Constantinople was growing desperate. Food was running short, and there was no sign of the Western relief force that Constantine had hoped for. The walls had been breached in several places and hastily repaired. The defenders were exhausted from constant alerts and repair work. On May 25th, rumors reached the city that a relief fleet was on its way. Constantine sent scouts who returned with devastating news. No ships were coming. This final disappointment crushed whatever hope remained. On the Ottoman side, a council of war revealed divisions. Some of Mehmed's advisors, concerned about the heavy casualties and a rumored relief fleet, suggested lifting the siege. But the Sultan was determined to make one final, all-out assault. He announced a day of rest on May 28th, followed by a final attack in the early hours of May 29th. That night, the city glowed with lights as citizens and soldiers attended a final service in the Hagia Sophia. Orthodox priests and Catholic cardinals set aside their theological differences to pray together. Emperor Constantine made a moving final speech to his commanders. For 7 generations our fathers have preserved this city, and for our time it has been entrusted to us. A city which was once so powerful is now reduced to weakness and desolation. That is our fate, to die in battle for our faith, for our country, for our families. The final Ottoman assault began shortly after midnight on May 29th. The attack came in waves. First came the irregular troops, the Bashi bazooks, used essentially as cannon fodder to exhaust Byzantine ammunition and energy. They were followed by the Anatolian Turkish regular troops, who also failed to break through. The decisive moment came just before dawn. A small gate, the Kerka Porta, which had been opened for a sortie, was either left open by mistake or could not be securely closed due to bodies blocking it after the fighters retreated. Some Ottoman troops discovered this vulnerability and entered the city. Around the same time, a more significant breakthrough occurred near the Blachernay Palace, where the walls had been severely damaged by cannon fire. The Genoese commander Giustiniani was severely wounded during this fighting. Despite Constantine's pleas for him to stay, he was carried to a ship and evacuated. His departure demoralized the remaining defenders. As the Ottoman troops poured through the breaches, Constantine reportedly threw off his imperial insignia so he could die as a common soldier rather than be captured. According to legend, he charged into the thickest fighting and was never seen again. His body was never positively identified. The Ottoman troops, many promised the right to plunder, rampaged through the city for the traditional 3 days allowed by Islamic law. Thousands of civilians sought sanctuary in the Hagia Sophia, believing in ancient prophecy that when the enemy reached the column of Constantine, an angel would descend from heaven and drive them back. Instead, the doors were broken down and the sanctuary violated. By afternoon, Mehmed II himself entered the city and ordered an end to the looting. Reaching the Hagia Sophia, he was reportedly moved by its beauty and immediately ordered it preserved, but converted to a mosque. According to some accounts, he entered the building and poured dust over his head in an act of humility before God who had granted him such a victory. The Sultan sought out the highest-ranking Byzantine officials who had survived and treated them with respect. He was determined to preserve Constantinople as his new capital and needed administrators who understood how the city functioned. Within days, he began offering incentives for former residents to return and for new settlers to repopulate the city. The fall of Constantinople reverberated throughout Europe and the Middle East. For Christians, it was a catastrophe of biblical proportions, the loss of the greatest Christian city and a 1,000-year-old empire. For the Muslim world, it was a triumph that even the earliest caliphs had failed to achieve. In practical terms, the Ottoman conquest accelerated several world-changing processes. First, it pushed Italian maritime powers to seek new routes to Asia, eventually leading to the age of exploration and Columbus's voyages. Second, Greek scholars fled west, bringing with them precious manuscripts that further fueled the Renaissance. Third, it established the Ottoman Empire as a major European power for centuries to come. For the city itself, now renamed Istanbul, though this name wouldn't become official until the 20th century, a new golden age began. Under Ottoman rule, the city once again became one of the world's largest and most cosmopolitan metropolises. The Hagia Sophia, with its new minarets, became the model for Ottoman imperial mosques that still define Istanbul's skyline today. In many ways, the events of 1453 marked the true end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the early modern period. The fall of Constantinople closed the final chapter of the Roman Empire, an institution that had shaped Western civilization for nearly 1,500 years. In its place arose a new world order, with gunpowder empires, oceanic trade routes, and a shifting balance between East and West. The last Roman emperor died in battle as the sun rose on May 29, 1453. By sunset, a new era had begun. The discovery of the New World, 1492. Dawn broke on the horizon as 3 small ships bobbed on the Atlantic swells. For 70 days, the crew had stared at nothing but endless ocean, their provisions dwindling, their patience wearing thin. Mutiny whispered through the ranks. The admiral had promised land within 30 days. Now they were more than 2 months into the journey with nothing to show for it but salt-cracked lips and growing desperation. Then, on October 12th, 1492, a lookout on the Pinta spotted something, a shadowy form breaking the perfect line where sea met sky. Tierra! Tierra! The cry echoed across the water. Christopher Columbus, the Genoese navigator leading this Spanish expedition, fell to his knees in prayer. He had gambled everything on his conviction that sailing west would lead to the riches of Asia. Now, land was finally in sight. Columbus could not have known that this moment would split human history into before and after. He believed he had reached the outskirts of Asia, perhaps Japan or islands near China. In reality, he had stumbled upon a hemisphere unknown to Europeans, a new world that would upend the global balance of power, unleash unprecedented ecological exchanges, decimate indigenous populations, and create entirely new societies. No other journey in human history had such profound consequences. Columbus's voyage triggered a chain reaction that would connect previously isolated continents, creating the first truly global network of human interaction. It marked the beginning of the modern era, a world knit together by oceanic trade, colonial empires, and the exchange of goods, diseases, ideas, and peoples across vast distances. Despite the monumental importance of his discovery, Columbus was not actually the first outsider to reach the Americas. Norse explorers from Scandinavia had established short-lived settlements in present-day Newfoundland around 1000 CE, nearly 5 centuries earlier. Evidence suggests that Polynesian sailors may have reached South America before Columbus. And of course, the Americas were already home to tens of millions of people whose ancestors had migrated from Asia at least 15,000 years earlier. What made Columbus's journey different was not that he was first, but that he was last. The last discoverer of the Americas whose voyage led to permanent, sustained contact between the eastern and western hemispheres. Unlike the Norse expeditions, which remained isolated episodes with minimal historical impact, Columbus's journey sparked immediate and extensive follow-up exploration, conquest, and colonization. The world would never be the same. Columbus himself was an unlikely figure to change history so dramatically. Born in Genoa, Italy around 1451 to a family of wool weavers, he went to sea as a teenager and educated himself through extensive reading. He developed an obsession with reaching Asia by sailing west across the Atlantic, driven by a combination of religious zeal, geographical theories, and pursuit of wealth and status. His plan was based on a critical miscalculation. Columbus believed the Earth was much smaller than it actually is, and that Asia extended much farther east than it does. He estimated the sailing distance from the Canary Islands to Japan at about 2,400 miles. The actual distance is closer to 12,000 miles. Had the Americas not existed, Columbus and his men would have perished at sea, their provisions exhausted long before reaching Asian shores. After years of rejection, Columbus finally secured sponsorship from the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella in 1492. Spain was newly unified after centuries of Muslim rule in parts of the peninsula, and its rulers were eager to compete with Portugal's growing maritime empire. They provided Columbus with 3 ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, and a royal charter granting him titles and a percentage of any wealth he might acquire. On that fateful October morning, Columbus landed on an island in the Bahamas that the native Taino people called Guanahani. He renamed it San Salvador and claimed it for Spain. Over the next few months, he explored parts of Cuba and Hispaniola, today's Haiti and Dominican Republic, convinced he was navigating among Asian islands near China and Japan. He returned to Spain in March 1493, bringing with him gold ornaments, exotic plants, and several kidnapped natives as evidence of his success. Columbus would make 3 more voyages to the Americas, gradually realizing the extent of his discovery, but never fully accepting that he had found continents previously unknown to Europeans, rather than outlying parts of Asia. He died in 1506, a wealthy but frustrated man, having failed to find a sea route to the riches of the East. By then, it was becoming clear to Europeans that Columbus had stumbled upon something unprecedented. In 1507, a German cartographer named Martin Waldseemüller produced the first map labeling the new lands America, after Italian explorer Amerigo Vespucci, who had written popular accounts of his own voyages suggesting these were indeed previously unknown continents. The discovery of the Americas unleashed waves of exploration, conquest, and colonization. Spain quickly established dominance, especially after Hernán Cortés conquered the Aztec Empire in Mexico, 1519 to 1521, and Francisco Pizarro overthrew the Inca Empire in Peru, 1532 to 1533. Portuguese, English, French, and Dutch expeditions followed, claiming territories and establishing colonies throughout the hemisphere. What followed was one of history's most consequential encounters, the Columbian exchange of plants, animals, diseases, technologies, and peoples between hemispheres that had developed in isolation from each other for millennia. This biological and cultural exchange transformed both sides of the Atlantic in ways that continue to shape our world today. For the Americas, the most immediate and devastating impact was demographic collapse. Indigenous populations with no immunity to European diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza died in staggering numbers. Estimates suggest that 90% of the native population of the Americas perished within a century of European contact. What had once been a hemisphere with tens of millions of inhabitants became a region with vast areas depopulated and vulnerable to European takeover. Disease was not the only catastrophe. European conquest brought violence, enslavement, and cultural destruction. Ancient civilizations with sophisticated achievements in mathematics, astronomy, architecture, agriculture, and the arts were systematically dismantled. Indigenous peoples who survived found themselves subjugated within new colonial societies that placed Europeans at the top of rigid racial hierarchies. The labor demands of European colonizers, combined with the decline in indigenous populations, led to another world-altering aspect of the Columbian exchange, the Atlantic slave trade. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, approximately 12.5 million Africans were forcibly transported to the Americas, with about 10.7 million surviving the brutal Middle Passage across the ocean. This massive forced migration created new African diaspora populations throughout the Americas and entrenched systems of racial slavery that would leave deep, enduring scars. The Columbian exchange also revolutionized global agriculture and diets. The Americas gave the world corn, potatoes, tomatoes, chocolate, peanuts, vanilla, pineapples, chili peppers, tobacco, and many other crops. European, Asian, and African diets were transformed. The humble potato alone, capable of yielding more calories per acre than any European grain, eventually helped fuel population growth that made the Industrial Revolution possible. Meanwhile, Europeans introduced wheat, rice, sugar, coffee, bananas, citrus fruits, and other crops to the Americas, along with cattle, horses, pigs, sheep, goats, and chickens. These agricultural exchanges extended human lifespans and supported population growth worldwide, but they also enabled new patterns of exploitation. Sugar, in particular, became the foundation of plantation economies throughout the Caribbean and Brazil, worked by enslaved Africans under brutal conditions to satisfy European sweet tooths. Cotton would later play a similar role in the southern United States, creating wealth for white plantation owners while entrenching systems of racial slavery. Beyond food, the Americas provided unprecedented mineral wealth, particularly silver from the great mines of Potosí in Bolivia and Zacatecas in Mexico. Between 1500 and 1800, approximately 85% of the world's silver and 70% of its gold came from the Americas. This influx of precious metals financed European wars, facilitated global trade, and contributed to price inflation throughout Europe. Spanish silver coins minted in Mexico became the world's first truly global currency, used in trade from Europe to China. For Europe, the discovery of the Americas was transformative. Countries with Atlantic coastlines gained new advantages over those oriented toward the Mediterranean. Spain briefly became Europe's dominant power, using American silver to fund its military and imperial ambitions. Later, Britain, France, and the Netherlands would build global empires partly based on American colonies and trade. The wealth flowing from Americas helped finance the Renaissance, the Scientific Revolution, and the Industrial Revolution. The American discoveries also challenged European intellectual frameworks. Traditional Christian cosmology had divided the world into 3 continents: Europe, Africa, and Asia, corresponding to the descendants of Noah's 3 sons. The existence of a 4th continent with previously unknown peoples raised theological questions about the universality of biblical history. Were indigenous Americans descendants of Adam and Eve? Why were they not mentioned in Scripture? Had they received Christ's message? These questions contributed to the intellectual ferment of the Renaissance and Reformation, as Europeans struggled to incorporate new knowledge into their worldviews. The Americas also provided inspiration for European political philosophers. Michel de Montaigne's essay On Cannibals used reports of indigenous American societies to critique European customs. Thomas More's Utopia and subsequent utopian literature drew on idealized accounts of American indigenous societies. Later, Enlightenment thinkers would use the American example to imagine new forms of political organization. The most dramatic political consequence came when European colonies in the Americas began achieving independence, beginning with the United States in 1783, and followed by Haiti and most of Latin America in the early 19th century. These new nations pioneered republican forms of government at a time when Europe remained dominated by monarchies. The American and French revolutions engaged in a transatlantic dialogue that would reshape political thought worldwide. For Africa, the discovery of the Americas led to the intensification of the slave trade, with devastating consequences. Coastal regions were depopulated, political systems destabilized, and economic development distorted to serve European demands. The demographic loss was staggering. Millions of people, predominantly young and healthy, were forcibly removed from African societies during their most productive years. The long-term impact on African development was profound and continues to shape the continent today. For Asia, the effects were initially less direct but ultimately no less significant. European powers, seeking to finance trade with China and other Asian economies, used silver from American mines as their primary medium of exchange. This American silver helped monetize the Chinese economy during the Ming and Qing dynasties. Later, European colonial empires built partly on American wealth would extend their reach into Asia, with profound consequences for India, Southeast Asia, and eventually China and Japan. The ecological dimensions of the Columbian exchange were equally revolutionary. Species of plants and animals that had evolved separately for millions of years were suddenly introduced to new environments. European livestock transformed American landscapes. American food crops altered agricultural patterns worldwide. Diseases moved in both directions, though with far more devastating impact on American populations than on European, African, or Asian ones. This unprecedented biological exchange continues today. Invasive species, agricultural practices, disease patterns, and human genetic admixture all reflect the ongoing consequences of connecting previously separate hemispheres. The human family, divided by the emergence of oceans 200,000 years ago, was reunited, for better and worse, after Columbus's journey. 5 centuries after Columbus landed in the Bahamas, the consequences of 1492 continue to shape our world. The modern global economy, with its intercontinental trade networks, emerged directly from the connections forged after his voyage. Contemporary nation-states throughout the Americas exist because of European colonization and its aftermath. Present-day patterns of wealth, poverty, and racial inequality reflect historical processes triggered by the Columbian exchange. Columbus did not discover America. Millions already called it home. What he did was far more significant. He began the process of reintegrating the human species across oceans that had divided us for millennia. That reconnection brought incalculable suffering through disease, conquest, and slavery. It also created our modern interconnected world, with all its complexity, diversity, and dynamism. Few moments in history have so clearly divided what came before from what came after. The printing press revolution, 15th century. In a modest workshop in Mainz, Germany, around 1440, a goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg was experimenting with an idea that would change the world more profoundly than any king's decree or general's conquest. Hunched over his workbench, surrounded by metal scraps and ink-stained papers, he was perfecting a system of movable metal type that could be arranged, inked, and pressed onto paper, then rearranged for the next page. The concept was deceptively simple, but its impact would be revolutionary. Before Gutenberg, books were painstakingly copied by hand. A single Bible might take a skilled scribe more than a year to complete, making books extraordinarily expensive treasures that only the wealthy or powerful institutions could afford. Knowledge was locked away in monasteries and royal libraries, accessible to only a privileged few. The written word itself was a luxury, its reproduction limited by human hands and human time. But after Gutenberg, everything changed. Within 50 years of his invention, an estimated 20 million volumes had been printed, more books than all European scribes had produced in the previous 1,000 years combined. Information could now be standardized, mass-produced, and distributed with unprecedented speed and accuracy. Ideas once confined to a single manuscript could reach thousands of readers across vast distances, igniting religious revolutions, scientific breakthroughs, and cultural transformations that continue to shape our world today. The printing press didn't just make books cheaper, it fundamentally altered how humans communicated, how knowledge spread, and who could participate in intellectual life. It democratized information in a way never before possible, shattering monopolies on learning and challenging established authorities. The printing revolution unleashed forces that would ultimately topple medieval power structures and usher in the modern world. Gutenberg himself did not grow rich from his world-changing invention. In fact, he was sued by his financial backer, Johann Fust, and lost control of his printing workshop just as his magnificent Bible, still considered one of the most beautiful books ever produced, was nearing completion. While others profited immensely from printing in the decades that followed, Gutenberg died in relative obscurity in 1468, likely unaware of the profound transformation his invention had set in motion. The technology itself had ancient roots. The Chinese had used wooden block printing since at least the 7th century and developed movable type made of clay, wood, and even metal by the 11th century. In Korea, metal movable type was being used by the early 13th century. However, these Asian innovations faced significant limitations in wider adoption. The Chinese writing system, with its thousands of characters, made typesetting enormously complex. European languages, with their relatively small alphabets, were far better suited to movable type technology. What made Gutenberg's system revolutionary was his combination of several key innovations. He developed a durable, reusable metal type by creating an alloy of lead, tin, and antimony that melted at a relatively low temperature, cast well in molds, and was sturdy enough for repeated use. He created a special oil-based ink that would adhere well to metal type and transfer cleanly to paper or vellum. Most importantly, he adapted a screw press used for making wine, allowing for uniform, consistent pressure when printing pages. This system was perfectly timed to meet rising demand. Europe in the mid-15th century was experiencing the early Renaissance, with growing literacy among merchants and professionals. Universities were expanding, creating new markets for texts. Paper, which had been introduced to Europe from the Islamic world several centuries earlier, was becoming more widely available and affordable than the traditional parchment made from animal skins. The first major work from Gutenberg's press was his famous 42-line Bible, completed around 1455. About 180 copies were printed, of which 49 are known to survive today. Each was sold for the equivalent of 3 years' wages for an average clerk, which was still far less expensive than a hand-copied Bible. These works demonstrated the remarkable quality possible with the new technology. Many initial viewers couldn't believe they weren't handwritten. News of Gutenberg's method spread with remarkable speed. By 1460, printing presses were operating in Strasbourg and Bamberg. By 1465, they had reached Cologne, Basel, and Rome. German printers traveled across Europe, establishing workshops in major cities. In 1470, the first press in France opened at the Sorbonne in Paris. By 1476, William Caxton had established England's first press at Westminster. Within just 50 years of Gutenberg's invention, printing had spread to more than 250 cities across Europe, with over 1,000 printing shops producing millions of books. The first printers typically focused on producing works with guaranteed markets, religious texts, classical literature, and legal documents. The Bible was naturally a bestseller, but printers also produced enormous quantities of indulgences, certificates sold by the Catholic Church that claimed to reduce time in purgatory for sinners. These small, standardized documents were perfect for mass production and extremely profitable. As printing expanded, so did the variety of materials produced. Affordable almanacs, filled with astrological predictions and practical information, became household staples. News pamphlets reported on battles, natural disasters, and sensational crimes. Woodcut illustrations, often hand-colored after printing, made information accessible even to those who couldn't read. Maps, musical notation, medical and scientific treatises all began to circulate more widely. The social impact of this new technology was immediate and far-reaching. For the first time in history, it was possible for an author's words to reach thousands of readers exactly as written. Before printing, manuscript copying inevitably introduced errors and variations with each new copy. After printing, textual standardization meant that scholars in different countries could refer to the same edition of a work with identical page numbers and consistent wording. This standardization revolutionized scholarly communication. Scientists could build on each other's work with greater precision. Mathematicians could share complex formulas without errors creeping in through copying. Botanists could reference specific pages in illustrated herb guides, confident that colleagues possessed identical copies. The scientific method itself, with its emphasis on replicable results and peer review, was made possible in part by the printing press. For ordinary people, the impact was no less profound. Literacy, once the domain of elites, became increasingly common among merchants, craftsmen, and even some peasants. Silent reading, as opposed to the common medieval practice of reading aloud, became more widespread, fostering a new kind of private intellectual experience. Women, though still facing significant barriers to education, found increased access to the written word, with some becoming printers themselves after inheriting businesses from husbands. Perhaps no institution was more dramatically affected by printing than the Catholic Church. Initially, church authorities embraced the new technology, using it to standardize liturgical practices and distribute approved texts. But this same technology soon undermined the Church's control over religious information. When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg in 1517, his criticisms of church practices might have remained a local academic dispute in earlier times. Instead, printers quickly reproduced his arguments, and within weeks they had spread throughout Germany. Within months, translations were circulating across Europe. Luther understood the power of the new medium and used it brilliantly. Between 1517 and 1520, his 30 publications sold over 300,000 copies. His translation of the Bible into German, New Testament in 1522, Complete Bible in 1534, used clear, vivid language accessible to ordinary people, rather than Latin understood only by clergy and scholars. For the first time, millions could read Scripture directly, rather than having it interpreted for them by priests. The Catholic Church recognized the threat and attempted to control printing through censorship, licensing, and the index of prohibited books. But these efforts were largely ineffective against a technology that was inherently decentralized. A banned book, suppressed in one city, could be printed in another. Printers often operated across jurisdictional boundaries, moving their equipment when threatened by authorities. The religious upheaval of the Protestant Reformation might have been impossible without printing. The technology allowed reformers to bypass traditional gatekeepers of knowledge, appealing directly to public opinion. It broke the Church's monopoly on religious interpretation and fostered religious individualism by putting sacred texts directly into the hands of lay readers. Similar patterns would repeat throughout history, as printing repeatedly enabled challenges to established authorities. Beyond religion, printing transformed politics by creating new forms of public discourse. Rulers quickly recognized the propaganda value of the press, commissioning flattering accounts of their achievements and justifications for their policies. But their opponents could use the same technology. During the German Peasants' War, of 1524 to 25, rebel manifestos were printed and distributed widely, helping coordinate uprisings across vast areas. During the English Civil War of the 1640s, competing political factions produced thousands of pamphlets arguing their positions. The concept of public opinion itself, the idea that rulers should consider the views of ordinary subjects, emerged partly through the print culture of the 16th and 17th centuries. As literacy spread and printed materials became more affordable, new social spaces developed where people gathered to read and discuss current events. Coffee houses, reading societies, and lending libraries. These institutions fostered critical thinking and political awareness among broader segments of society. National identities were also strengthened by print culture. As publishers sought the widest possible markets, they increasingly printed in vernacular languages rather than Latin. This trend accelerated the standardization of languages like French, English, and German, reducing regional dialects and establishing correct forms that readers across broad geographic areas could understand. Shared reading experiences of novels, histories, and newspapers helped forge common cultural references that transcended local boundaries. The scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries was inextricably linked to printing. Natural philosophers like Copernicus, Galileo, and Newton could build on each other's work with unprecedented precision. Scientific academies published journals sharing experimental results. Detailed anatomical illustrations revolutionized medicine. Mathematical tables essential for navigation and astronomy could be reproduced without error. Even the collaborative nature of modern science, with researchers building systematically on previous discoveries, was facilitated by the reliable transmission of information that printing made possible. Economic life was transformed as well. Merchants used printed manuals to learn bookkeeping techniques. Standardized contracts and forms streamlined business transactions. Price lists and catalogs expanded commercial networks, advertising new products and services. The concept of intellectual property emerged as authors and publishers sought legal protection for their work, leading to copyright laws and patents. Information itself became a commodity that could be bought and sold. Education was democratized as textbooks became more affordable. Whereas medieval students often learned by listening to professors read from rare manuscripts, Renaissance students could own personal copies of texts to study independently. Identical textbooks meant students and teachers could literally be on the same page, referring to specific passages by number. Illustrations made complex concepts easier to understand. Self-education became possible for motivated individuals without access to formal schooling. By 1600, approximately 200 million books had been printed in Europe, creating a fundamental shift in how information was stored, shared, and created. This print revolution laid the groundwork for the Enlightenment of the 18th century, with its emphasis on reason, empirical evidence, and the free exchange of ideas. It fostered new conceptions of individual rights, religious tolerance, and constitutional governance that would eventually reshape political systems worldwide. Yet the printing revolution also had darker aspects. Mass-produced propaganda spread hatred and incited violence. Slanderous pamphlets ruined reputations. Pseudo-scientific medical texts promoted dangerous remedies. Censorship and book burning became tools of oppression. The same technology that could educate could also mislead and manipulate. These dual possibilities of enlightenment and propaganda have remained characteristic of communication technologies through the present day. The social disruption caused by printing parallels our own experience with digital information technology. Like internet pioneers, early printers operated in a rapidly evolving landscape with few established rules. Traditional authorities struggled to control the new medium. Visionaries saw utopian possibilities, while others feared moral corruption and social disorder. Information overload became a concern as early as the 16th century, when scholars complained about the confusing and harmful abundance of books. Gutenberg's invention, which began with a craftsman tinkering in his workshop, launched a revolution that transformed every aspect of human culture. Religious practices, scientific inquiry, political organization, economic activity, and personal identity were all reshaped by the technology of printing with movable type. These changes unfolded over centuries, with effects that would have been impossible for Gutenberg himself to imagine. The printing press democratized knowledge, challenging traditional authorities and empowering ordinary people with unprecedented access to information. It standardized and preserved human knowledge in ways that accelerated innovation across all fields of endeavor. It created new forms of community through shared reading experiences, while also enabling more private, individual engagement with ideas. It made possible mass movements, religious, political, and social, that could coordinate action across vast distances. When we read a book, scan a newspaper, or browse a website today, we are experiencing the legacy of Gutenberg's revolution. A revolution not in warfare or governance, but in how humans communicate and share knowledge. In those ink-stained metal letters arranged in rows, Gutenberg had created something that would transform humanity's relationship with information forever. The Industrial Revolution, 18th to 19th century. The rhythmic pounding of steam-powered hammers echoed through the valleys of northern England. Massive brick factories belched black smoke into once clear skies. Inside these cathedrals of industry, men, women, and children toiled for 14 hours a day amid deafening machinery that never ceased, never tired, never slowed. Outside, a landscape once dominated by fields and forests was rapidly transforming, crisscrossed by railways, dotted with coal mines, and increasingly crowded with hastily built housing for the thousands flocking to new centers of production. This was England in the early 19th century, epicenter of a transformation more profound than any political revolution. For most of human history, people had lived much as their grandparents and great-grandparents had before them, working the land with tools and techniques that changed only incrementally over centuries. Power came primarily from human muscles, supplemented by animals, water, and wind. Most goods were crafted by hand. Transportation happened at the speed of a horse's gallop. News traveled no faster than a ship could sail. The Industrial Revolution shattered this ancient pattern, beginning in Britain around 1760 and gathering momentum through the 19th century. This transformation fundamentally altered how humans made things, moved things, powered things, and organized their economic lives. Its consequences rippled outward, reshaping society, politics, culture, the environment, and eventually the entire planet. The machines came first, mechanical devices that multiplied human productive capacity exponentially. In 1764, James Hargreaves invented the spinning jenny, allowing a single worker to spin multiple threads simultaneously. Richard Arkwright's water frame, 1769, produced stronger threads using water power. Samuel Crompton's spinning mule, 1779, combined these innovations, revolutionizing thread production. Edmund Cartwright's power loom, 1784, then mechanized weaving. Together, these inventions transformed textile manufacturing from a cottage industry to factory production. The pivotal breakthrough, however, was in power generation. The steam engine, developed into a practical technology by Thomas Newcomen and dramatically improved by James Watt in the 1760s to 70s, freed manufacturing from dependence on flowing water. Factories could now be built anywhere, especially near coal mines that fueled their engines. Steam power drove machinery that could run continuously, vastly increasing output, while demanding new forms of labor organization and discipline. Coal became the lifeblood of this new industrial system. Britain's abundant coal reserves provided the energy density needed to power steam engines, smelt iron, and later generate electricity. Coal mining itself was transformed by steam-powered pumps that allowed deeper excavation. The fossil fuel age had begun, the first time in human history that economic growth became dependent on energy sources accumulated over millions of years, rather than annual flows of solar energy captured through agriculture. Iron and later steel production expanded dramatically through innovations like Abraham Darby's coke smelting method, Henry Bessemer's converter, and the Siemens Martin open hearth process. These stronger, more abundant metals enabled everything from railway tracks to machinery, from bridges to buildings, from steam engines to eventually automobiles. Transportation underwent its own revolution. Roads improved through techniques pioneered by engineers like John McAdam. Canal systems expanded, allowing bulk goods to move inland. Most dramatically, railways emerged following George Stephenson's successful locomotive demonstrations in the 1820s. The first major line between Liverpool and Manchester opened in 1830. By 1850, Britain had over 6,000 miles of track. Railways compressed time and space, allowing unprecedented movement of people and goods. Fresh food could reach cities from distant farms. Businesses could ship products nationwide. People could travel farther for work or leisure than ever before. Communications transformed in parallel. The telegraph, commercialized in the 1840s, separated communication from transportation for the first time in history. Messages that once took weeks to cross oceans now traveled almost instantaneously. Financial markets integrated nationally and eventually globally. Newspapers received distant news in real time. Governments could coordinate activities across vast territories. The world began to shrink. These technological innovations required and enabled new forms of business organization. The factory system concentrated workers under one roof, supervised by managers and working to the rhythm of machines rather than natural light or seasons. Capital requirements for industrial ventures exceeded what individual proprietors could provide, spurring the development of more sophisticated financial institutions and eventually limited liability corporations that could aggregate investment from multiple shareholders. The social consequences were equally profound. Urbanization accelerated dramatically as people migrated from agricultural regions to industrial centers seeking employment. Manchester's population grew from around 25,000 in 1773 to over 300,000 by 1850. Similar growth occurred in Birmingham, Leeds, Glasgow, and dozens of other industrial cities. This rapid urbanization created unprecedented challenges: housing shortages, sanitation crises, pollution, and social dislocations. Working conditions in early factories were often brutal. The machines set the pace, demanding constant attention in hot, noisy, dangerous environments. Hours were long, typically 12 to 16 hours daily, 6 days a week. Injuries were common, and compensation non-existent. Children as young as 5 or 6 worked in factories and mines, their small size useful for tasks like cleaning machinery or crawling through narrow mine shafts. Living conditions matched the harshness of work. Housing was hastily constructed, overcrowded, and lacking basic sanitation. Clean water was scarce. Sewage flowed in open gutters. Coal smoke blackened buildings and lungs alike. Infectious diseases spread rapidly through crowded tenements. Life expectancy in industrial cities fell well below that of rural areas. Friedrich Engels, who studied Manchester's working class in the 1840s, described filth, ruin, and uninhabitableness that shocked even a man familiar with the poor conditions in German industrial areas. Yet the Industrial Revolution also created unprecedented wealth and eventually raised living standards. Consumer goods became more affordable as machine production reduced costs. Cotton textiles, once luxury items, became accessible to ordinary people. Iron cookware, glass windows, and eventually more sophisticated products like sewing machines entered working-class homes. Food production increased through agricultural improvements and better transportation, gradually improving nutrition. The new industrial capitalists, men like Richard Arkwright, Josiah Wedgwood, and Matthew Boulton, amassed fortunes that rivaled those of traditional aristocrats. A middle class of professionals, managers, and shopkeepers expanded. Even as inequality initially increased, the total economic pie grew dramatically. By the late 19th century, real wages for British workers had begun a sustained rise that would eventually transform the working class from impoverished laborers to consumers with discretionary income. This economic transformation inevitably produced political responses. Workers began organizing to protect their interests, forming friendly societies, trade unions, and eventually political parties. The Luddites famously smashed textile machinery between 1811 and 16, protesting not technology itself but its use in ways that threatened their livelihoods. The Chartist movement of the 1830s to 40s demanded political rights for working men. Reformers like Robert Owen pioneered more humane factory management and advocated cooperative communities. Governments gradually responded with regulatory legislation. Britain's Factory Acts limited child labor and women's working hours while mandating safety measures. Public health reforms addressed urban sanitation crises. Education acts established schools for working-class children. Political rights expanded gradually through the 19th century, partly in response to industrial workers' growing organization and demands. Intellectually, the Industrial Revolution inspired competing analyses. Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, 1776, celebrated market-driven growth and division of labor. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels saw industrialization as creating both unprecedented productive capacity and deep exploitation, predicting in The Communist Manifesto, 1848, that capitalist contradictions would eventually lead to revolution. Romantic poets and artists like William Blake and J.M.W. Turner expressed horror at industrialization's impact on nature and human dignity, while others celebrated technological achievement. From Britain, industrialization spread outward. Belgium, France, and parts of Germany industrialized from the early 19th century. The United States developed its own industrial system, particularly in New England, and later the Great Lakes region. By the late 19th century, industrial development had reached Russia, Japan, and other regions previously on the economic periphery. This globalization of industry created new international divisions of labor. Colonial and semi-colonial regions increasingly supplied raw materials, cotton from the American South, India, and Egypt, rubber from Brazil, and later Southeast Asia, minerals from Africa, wool from Australia. Manufacturing concentrated in Europe and North America, which then exported finished goods to global markets, often protected by imperial arrangements. The environmental impact was unprecedented. Fossil fuel consumption released carbon that had been sequestered underground for millions of years. Forests were cleared for timber and agriculture at accelerating rates. Rivers became disposal systems for industrial waste. Urban air became so polluted that London's infamous pea super fogs, actually toxic smog, occasionally killed thousands in a single event. The relationship between humans and the natural world fundamentally changed as industrial society increasingly viewed nature as a resource to be exploited rather than a system humans inhabited. The Industrial Revolution represents one of history's great inflection points, a fundamental reorganization of how humans lived, worked, and related to each other and the natural world. It created the material foundations of modern life, from electric lighting to motorized transportation, from mass communication to mass production. It enabled population growth from under 1 billion humans in 1800 to over 7 billion today by dramatically increasing food production and distribution. Yet its legacy remains deeply ambiguous. The same processes that created unprecedented wealth and eventually raised living standards also produced exploitation, pollution, and colonial subjugation. The fossil fuel economy that powered industrial growth now threatens planetary climate stability. The consumer society born from industrial abundance both fulfills human desires and depletes finite resources. Perhaps most fundamentally, the Industrial Revolution accelerated the pace of change itself. For most of human history, a person could expect to die in a world very similar to the one they were born into. After industrialization, each generation experienced a significantly different technological and economic reality. This acceleration continues today, with technological change now occurring at a pace that requires adaptation within individual lifetimes rather than across generations. When those first steam engines began pounding in northern England, they announced not just a new way of making textiles, but a new relationship between humans and time, humans and nature, humans and work. They initiated our modern world, with all its wonders and contradictions, a world of material abundance and environmental degradation, of life-saving medical technologies and planet-threatening carbon emissions, of mass literacy and mass consumerism. For better and worse, we still live in the world the Industrial Revolution created. The French Revolution, 1789. The summer air in Paris hung thick with tension on July 14th, 1789. Crowds of ordinary citizens, shopkeepers, craftsmen, laborers, gathered in the streets, their faces gaunt from months of bread shortages. Rumors swirled that the king was amassing troops to crush the recently formed National Assembly. Searching for weapons to defend themselves, the crowd turned its attention to the Bastille, a medieval fortress serving as a prison and ammunition storehouse. What began as a search for gunpowder escalated into a confrontation. Negotiations between the crowd and the fortress governor broke down. Shots were fired. By day's end, the imposing symbol of royal authority had fallen to the people. The governor was beheaded, his head paraded through the streets on a pike. When King Louis XVI was informed of the event, he reportedly asked, "Is it a revolt?" His advisor replied, "No, sire, it is a revolution." Indeed it was, and not just any revolution, but one that would become a template for political upheavals for centuries to come. The French Revolution marked the moment when traditional authority based on divine right, aristocratic privilege, and centuries of tradition crumbled before new ideas of popular sovereignty, citizenship, and natural rights. It introduced concepts and conflicts that still shape our political discourse today. Left versus right, revolution versus reaction, individual liberty versus collective equality. The storming of the Bastille didn't occur in a vacuum. France had been simmering with discontent for years. The nation was nearly bankrupt, largely due to its costly involvement in the American Revolution and decades of extravagant spending by the monarchy. A series of poor harvests in 1788 to 89 had caused bread prices to soar, bringing genuine hunger to much of the population. Meanwhile, the Enlightenment had spread ideas challenging traditional authority, ideas of natural rights, social contracts, and government by consent. The immediate trigger came when King Louis XVI, desperate to address the financial crisis, summoned the Estates General, a medieval representative assembly that hadn't met since 1614. This body was divided into 3 estates: the first estate, clergy; the second estate, nobility; and the third estate, everyone else, about 98% of the population. Each estate had 1 vote, ensuring that the privileged classes could always outvote the commoners. The third estate refused to accept this arrangement. On June 17, 1789, they declared themselves the National Assembly, claiming to represent the people of France. When locked out of their meeting hall 3 days later, they moved to a nearby tennis court and took the famous tennis court oath, vowing not to disband until they had given France a constitution. This assertion of popular sovereignty directly challenged the king's absolute authority. The fall of the Bastille accelerated the collapse of the old order. In rural areas, peasants attacked manor houses, burning feudal records that documented their obligations to aristocratic landlords. This great fear spread throughout the countryside in late July and August. Faced with this unrest, the National Assembly abolished feudal privileges on August 4th in a dramatic night session where nobles voluntarily renounced their traditional rights. On August 26th, the Assembly issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, a founding document of the modern human rights tradition. Heavily influenced by the American Declaration of Independence and Enlightenment philosophy, it proclaimed that men are born and remain free and equal in rights, and that these rights included liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. It declared that sovereignty resided in the nation, not the monarch, and that law was the expression of the general will. These monumental changes occurred in just the revolution's first few months. Over the next decade, France would experience a dizzying series of political transformations, growing radicalization, periods of extraordinary violence, and eventually a retreat to more conservative governance. Through it all, French society was fundamentally reordered, inspiring both fervent admiration and horrified opposition across Europe and beyond. Initially, the revolution aimed to create a constitutional monarchy, not abolish the king entirely. The National Assembly worked to create a new governmental system while maintaining Louis XVI as head of state with reduced powers. They reorganized France's administrative divisions, nationalized church property to address financial problems, and established a constitutional system with a unicameral legislature elected by property-owning citizens. However, the revolution faced mounting challenges. Conservative clergy rejected the civil constitution of the clergy, which subordinated the church to the state. Foreign monarchs grew alarmed at events in France, fearing revolutionary contagion in their own lands. In June 1791, the royal family attempted to flee the country, but was captured at Varennes, severely undermining trust in the king's commitment to the new constitutional arrangement. War accelerated the revolution's radicalization. In April 1792, revolutionary France declared war on Austria, beginning what would become decades of nearly continuous European conflict. Early military defeats increased paranoia about internal enemies. On August 10, 1792, militants stormed the Tuileries Palace, effectively ending the monarchy. The newly elected National Convention formally abolished the monarchy on September 21st and declared France a republic. The revolution then entered its most radical and violent phase. Evidence of Louis XVI's correspondence with foreign powers led to his trial for treason. On January 21, 1793, the former king was executed by guillotine in the Place de la Révolution. Foreign reaction was swift, with more European powers joining the war against revolutionary France. Internally, counter-revolutionary uprisings broke out in the Vendée region and several major cities. Facing these existential threats, the revolution turned to extraordinary measures. The Committee of Public Safety, led by Maximilien Robespierre, became the de facto government. The law of suspects, passed in September 1793, authorized the arrest of anyone deemed an enemy of the revolution. The Revolutionary Tribunal dispensed swift justice with minimal legal protections. Thousands were executed, their severed heads displayed to cheering crowds. This period, known as the Reign of Terror, saw revolutionary ideology reach its most extreme expression. The government adopted a new republican calendar, starting with Year 1 of Liberty. Churches were converted to temples of reason, as traditional religion was suppressed in favor of revolutionary cults. Price controls were imposed on essential goods. The committee even attempted to regulate private behavior according to revolutionary virtue. Yet the terror contained the seeds of its own destruction. As external threats receded with French military victories, the justification for extreme measures weakened. Robespierre's increasingly paranoid rhetoric alienated even his allies. On September 27, 1794, the convention turned against him. Robespierre and his closest associates were arrested and guillotined the next day, ending the terror. The post-terror period saw a retreat from radical policies. The new Constitution of 1795 established the Directory, a more conservative republic governed by wealthy property owners. Revolutionary tribunals were dismantled. Economic controls were lifted. Religious persecution eased. Yet the Directory proved corrupt and ineffective, relying increasingly on the military to maintain power amid continuing political instability and war. This created the conditions for the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, a brilliant young general whose military victories had made him a national hero. On November 9, 1799, 18 Brumaire, Napoleon staged a coup that ended the Directory and eventually established himself as first consul. Though he preserved many revolutionary reforms, his increasingly autocratic rule and eventual self-coronation as emperor in 1804 marked the revolution's end. Yet the ideas unleashed by the French Revolution proved impossible to contain. Its core concepts, popular sovereignty, citizenship based on equality rather than birth, secularism in public affairs, and nationalism as a political identity, spread across Europe and the world. The revolutionary model of rapid, radical political change through popular mobilization would be replicated in countless later revolutions, from Latin American independence movements to the Russian Revolution. The revolution's impact extended far beyond politics. It transformed social structures by abolishing legal distinctions between classes and creating opportunities based on talent rather than birth. The metric system, developed during this period, rationalized weights and measures. Educational reforms established new technical schools and universities based on merit. The revolution's emphasis on public arts and sciences reflected its belief in reason as a guiding force for society. The revolution also pioneered modern political culture. The terms left and right originated from seating arrangements in the National Assembly, with radicals sitting on the left and conservatives on the right. Political clubs like the Jacobins developed techniques of mass mobilization. Revolutionary newspapers, pamphlets, and songs created a vibrant public sphere. Political symbols and rituals, the tricolor flag, the Marseillaise, public festivals, helped build national identity. For women, the revolution offered both promise and disappointment. Women participated actively in revolutionary events, from the Women's March on Versailles in October 1789 to forming political clubs, and even fighting in revolutionary armies. Activists like Olympe de Gouges, who wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen, demanded full equality. Yet the revolutionary government eventually suppressed women's political organizations and explicitly denied women voting rights, showing the limits of revolutionary equality. The French Revolution's legacy remains contested to this day. For some, it represents the birth of modern liberty, equality, and democracy, a necessary if sometimes violent break with an unjust past. For others, it exemplifies how utopian political projects can descend into bloodshed and tyranny. Both perspectives contain truth, reflecting the revolution's complex and contradictory nature. What's undeniable is that the revolution marked a decisive turning point between the old world and the new. Before 1789, most Europeans lived in societies where inequality was considered natural and divinely ordained, where monarchs ruled by hereditary right, and where tradition governed social relations. After the Revolution, even the most conservative regimes had to reckon with new ideas about popular consent, constitutional government, and citizenship rights. The revolutionary slogan, "Liberty, Equality, Fraternity," continues to inspire political movements worldwide. The revolution's Declaration of the Rights of Man provided a template for later human rights documents, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Modern conceptions of citizenship, civic nationalism, and secular government all owe significant debts to revolutionary France. Yet the revolution also revealed the tensions inherent in these ideals. Can liberty and equality coexist when they sometimes pull in opposite directions? How can a revolution claiming to represent the people's will determine who constitutes the people and who deserves exclusion as enemies of the revolution? Can revolutionary violence be justified by appeals to necessity or higher goals? These questions, first posed starkly during the French Revolution, continue to challenge political thinkers and actors today. When the Parisian crowd stormed the Bastille on that July day in 1789, they weren't just attacking a prison. They were breaching the walls of a world governed by tradition, hierarchy, and divine right. The world that emerged from this breach, though still incomplete, laid the foundations for our modern political existence, a world of citizens rather than subjects, of nations rather than dynasties, of rights claimed by virtue of common humanity rather than granted by royal favor. The French Revolution transformed people's understanding of what politics could do, that human action could fundamentally reshape society according to rational principles rather than accepting inherited arrangements as immutable. This transformation, born in hope, tempered by violence, and ultimately unfinished, continues to reverberate through history, challenging each generation to reinterpret its meaning for their own time. The African Campaign, Germany's Colonial War. The humid air hung heavy in the East African bush as Lieutenant Colonel Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck studied the intelligence reports before him. It was August 1914, and news had just reached German East Africa that the European powers had plunged into war. As the newly appointed commander of a small colonial force, just 260 German officers and 2,472 African Askari soldiers, von Lettow-Vorbeck faced an impossible situation. Surrounding his territory were the vastly larger colonies of Britain, Belgium, and Portugal, all now enemy powers with superior numbers and resources. The logical course would have been surrender. The governor of German East Africa, Heinrich Schnee, preferred exactly that, a neutral stance to spare the colony from the European conflict. But von Lettow-Vorbeck saw a different opportunity. If he could tie down significant Allied forces in Africa, he would prevent them from fighting on the critical Western Front in Europe. We were not strong enough to await the enemy's attack in the open field, he would later write. It was necessary to counteract the numerical superiority of the enemy by moving with the utmost rapidity. With this decision, one of history's most remarkable military campaigns began, a 4-year guerrilla war across East Africa that would demonstrate both the heights of tactical brilliance and the devastating impact of European imperial rivalries on African populations. While millions died in the mud of Flanders and France, another war raged across the savannas, mountains, and jungles of Africa, largely forgotten in the shadow of the Western Front, but no less significant for those who experienced it. The African theater of World War I emerged directly from the scramble for Africa, the frenzied colonial land grab of the late 19th century that had carved the continent into European possessions. Germany, a latecomer to the imperial game, had established 4 African colonies: Togoland, today's Togo, and eastern Ghana, Cameroon and parts of neighboring countries, German Southwest Africa, Namibia, and German East Africa, Tanzania, Rwanda, and Burundi. These territories were surrounded by the much larger colonial empires of Britain and France, creating multiple potential fronts when war erupted. The opening moves came swiftly. On August 7, 1914, just days after war was declared in Europe, British forces from the Gold Coast invaded Togoland. By August 26th, the small German force there had surrendered. In Cameroon, a more extended campaign lasted until February 1916, with German troops eventually retreating into neutral Spanish Guinea. In Southwest Africa, South African forces led by former Boer generals Louis Botha and Jan Smuts overcome initial setbacks to secure the colony's surrender by July 1915. But East Africa proved a far more challenging proposition. The colony was larger, its terrain more varied and difficult, and in von Lettow-Vorbeck, it had a commander of exceptional ability. I knew that the fate of the colonies would be decided on the battlefields of Europe, he later wrote, but each enemy soldier we could keep occupied in Africa would not be fighting on the Western Front. From the war's first days, von Lettow-Vorbeck embraced an aggressive strategy, striking across the border into British East Africa, Kenya, to destroy the Uganda Railway, the vital British supply line. On November 4th, 1914, his forces attacked the border town of Tanga when British Indian troops attempted a landing. Despite being outnumbered 8-1, the German defenders routed the British invasion force, capturing valuable weapons and ammunition that would sustain their campaign. This pattern would repeat throughout the war. Von Lettow-Vorbeck's smaller but more mobile force repeatedly outmaneuvering larger but cumbersome British columns. The Germans turned the harsh African environment into an ally, using their knowledge of local terrain and conditions, while British troops suffered from malaria, dysentery, and other tropical diseases. For every soldier killed in combat in East Africa, dozens died from illness. By early 1916, the military balance began to shift. General Jan Smuts arrived with South African reinforcements, eventually building an allied force of over 70,000 men, drawn from Britain, India, South Africa, Belgium, Portugal, and various African colonies. They launched a massive offensive that forced the Germans to abandon much of their territory, though not without extracting a heavy toll on the attackers. Smuts reported to London that he had achieved victory, but von Lettow-Vorbeck and his core force remained undefeated, retreating into the southern highlands of German East Africa. What followed was one of the most extraordinary military odysseys in history. With dwindling supplies and cut off from Germany, von Lettow-Vorbeck's force lived off the land, captured enemy supplies, and maintained mobility at all costs. Our strategic position was hopeless from the start, one German officer recorded, but not our tactical situation as long as we could choose the time and place to fight. In November 1917, pressure from British forces compelled von Lettow-Vorbeck to make a fateful decision. He would abandon German territory entirely and invade Portuguese East Africa, Mozambique. This audacious move caught the Allies by surprise. The Portuguese colonial forces proved no match for the hardened German-led troops, who captured vast stockpiles of weapons and supplies from poorly defended Portuguese outposts. For nearly a year, the German force moved through Mozambique, always staying one step ahead of pursuing columns. By September 1918, they had circled back north into German East Africa briefly before crossing into northern Rhodesia, Zambia. After fighting a successful engagement at Kasama on November 13th, von Lettow-Vorbeck received word that an armistice had been signed in Europe. Only then, on November 25, 1918, did he surrender his undefeated force, still 155 Europeans and 1,168 Askaris strong, at Abercorn. The German commander had accomplished his strategic objective to an astonishing degree. To hunt his small force, the Allies had deployed over 300,000 troops over 4 years, suffering around 10,000 European deaths, mostly from disease, and far higher African casualties. Military expenditures were enormous, particularly for Britain, at a time when every resource was needed for the decisive European theaters. Yet the military brilliance of this campaign obscures its devastating impact on African populations. The true forgotten story of Africa's World War I is not the tactical maneuvering of European officers, but the immense suffering of ordinary Africans, caught in the maelstrom of imperial conflict. Both sides relied heavily on African carriers, porters who transported supplies through terrain where vehicles couldn't operate and railways didn't exist. The British alone recruited over 1 million carriers in East Africa, while German forces conscripted thousands more. These men carried loads of up to 60 pounds through swamps, mountains, and forests, often poorly fed and clothed, with mortality rates that sometimes exceeded 20%. Carriers have died literally by the roadside, one British officer wrote. Their bodies mark the paths we have taken, for it is impossible to bury them all. African communities suffered forced recruitment, requisitioned food, and deliberate destruction of crops and villages to deny resources to the enemy. As armies moved through fertile regions, they stripped them bare, triggering food shortages and famine. In German East Africa, between 300,000 and 500,000 civilians died from war-related causes, primarily famine and disease. The total death toll across all African theaters may have reached 1 million or more, though precise figures remain impossible to establish due to poor record-keeping regarding African lives. The conflict also drew in African soldiers from across the continent. In addition to the German Askaris, Britain deployed West African regiments from Nigeria, Gold Coast, Sierra Leone, and Gambia. South African units included both white South Africans and members of the Cape-Colored Corps. France brought tirailleurs from Senegal and other West African colonies. These soldiers fought with distinction despite often receiving inferior equipment, pay, and recognition compared to their European counterparts. The war exposed the contradiction at the heart of European colonialism. Allied propaganda portrayed the conflict as a fight for civilization and the liberation of Africans from harsh German rule. Yet all colonial powers practiced forms of exploitation, racial discrimination, and authoritarian control. When British Commander Smuts spoke of bringing the inestimable blessings of British rule to former German colonies, he represented the same South African government that had institutionalized racial segregation at home. This contradiction was not lost on educated Africans. The war accelerated political awareness, as returning soldiers brought home new perspectives and expectations after fighting in a supposedly democratic cause. If we are good enough to fight the Germans, asked one West African newspaper, why are we not good enough to have a share in ruling our country? The post-war settlement reorganized Africa's map, according to European interests, with little consideration for African aspirations. Germany's colonies were distributed to the victors as mandates under the new League of Nations, thinly veiled transfers of colonial territory. Britain and France gained most of Germany's former possessions, while Belgium received Rwanda and Burundi, and South Africa took control of Southwest Africa. These transfers came with nominal obligations to govern in the interests of local populations, but in practice, little changed in colonial administration. The promise of self-determination championed by American President Woodrow Wilson applied to Europeans, not Africans. When the Pan-African Congress met in Paris during the 1919 peace negotiations, its calls for African rights and eventual self-government were ignored by the great powers. The most enduring European myth about Africa's World War I centers on von Lettow-Vorbeck and his undefeated Askaris. After the war, the German commander was celebrated for his tactical brilliance and supposedly enlightened treatment of African troops. He returned to Germany a hero, one of the few German commanders to emerge from the war with reputation enhanced. His 1920 book, My Reminiscences of East Africa, became a military classic, studied even today for its lessons in guerrilla warfare. This narrative conveniently overlooked the harsh realities of German colonial rule before and during the war, while von Lettow-Vorbeck did maintain more egalitarian relationships with his African soldiers than was typical for the era. His campaign caused immense suffering among civilian populations. German forces routinely seized food from villages, conscripted porters at gunpoint, and destroyed infrastructure. The needs of military expediency always outweighed humanitarian concerns. After the war, German veterans promoted the myth of the loyal Askari to counter the stab-in-the-back narrative emerging in Germany. The idea that the German army had not been defeated in the field, but betrayed by revolution at home. The image of steadfast African soldiers loyally serving their German officers became a powerful symbol, used even during the Nazi era to advocate for the return of Germany's colonies. The truth was more complex. African soldiers served in colonial armies for diverse reasons. Some were conscripted, others joined for regular pay and status, while some saw military service as preferable to other forms of colonial labor. Their loyalty reflected professional military discipline more than enthusiasm for German imperial aims. After the war, many former Askaris waited years for promised pensions and recognition, with final payments not made until the 1960s. For the African territories where the fighting occurred, the war's legacy was mixed. The conflict accelerated infrastructure development in some regions, with new roads, railways, and ports built for military purposes. Medical facilities established for European troops sometimes benefited local populations after the war. The mandate system brought slightly more international scrutiny to colonial governance, if not fundamental change. But the war also left lasting scars. Landmines and unexploded ordnance remained dangerous for decades. Economic exploitation intensified as colonial powers sought to recoup war costs. Boundaries drawn by Europeans with little regard for ethnic or geographic realities created problems that persist into the 21st century. While Europe memorialized its Great War dead with monuments and remembrance ceremonies, Africa's massive sacrifices went largely uncommemorated. No African representatives were invited to the Paris Peace Conference. No African soldiers marched in London's Victory Parade. The war that had supposedly been fought for freedom and self-determination reinforced imperial control across the continent. Today, as scholars and public historians work to recover these forgotten fronts, the African campaign offers vital perspectives on World War I's global nature. It reminds us that the world in World War was not rhetorical. The conflict truly engulfed populations across continents, with consequences far beyond Europe's trenches. It demonstrates how imperial competition brought devastation to regions and peoples far removed from the disputes that triggered the war. Most importantly, centering African experiences in the war's history challenges us to recognize the agency and sacrifice of those long relegated to historical footnotes. The carriers who transported supplies through impossible terrain, the farmers who lost harvests and homes, the soldiers who fought under colonial flags. Their stories are essential to understanding not just this forgotten front, but the true nature and cost of global conflict. The Fall of the Berlin Wall, 1989. The evening of November 9th, 1989, began like any other in divided Berlin. The concrete barrier that had split the city for 28 years still stood, patrolled by armed East German guards with orders to shoot anyone attempting to cross, illegally. On the eastern side, 16 million citizens of the German Democratic Republic lived under the watchful eye of the communist government and its feared Stasi secret police. On the western side, the capitalist showcase of West Berlin gleamed with prosperity and freedom that remained tantalizingly visible but unreachable to those in the east. Then came the press conference that changed everything. Günter Schabowski, a member of East Germany's ruling Politburo, was concluding a rather mundane televised briefing when a journalist asked about rumors of new travel regulations. Schabowski, inadequately briefed on policies still being finalized, glanced at his notes and announced that East Germans would be allowed to cross the border immediately, without delay. The statement was premature and imprecise. The actual policy was supposed to involve an orderly permit application process starting the next day, but the damage was done. East Berliners, watching this broadcast with astonishment, began gathering at border crossings, demanding to be let through. Confused guards without clear instructions and facing growing crowds eventually opened the gates. By midnight, thousands of East Germans were pouring into West Berlin, embraced by jubilant Westerners. People danced atop the wall, took swings at it with hammers and chisels, and celebrated through the night. A structure built to divide had suddenly become a platform for unity. The Berlin Wall, the most potent symbol of the Cold War, was functionally dead. The fall of the Berlin Wall marked the beginning of the end for communist rule in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union itself. Within 2 years, the Cold War that had dominated global politics for nearly half a century would be over. Germany would reunify. The Soviet Union would dissolve. The bipolar world order that had shaped international relations since World War II would give way to a new era of American hegemony and globalization. Few moments in history so clearly divide what came before from what came after. The fall of the wall represented the collapse not just of a physical barrier, but of an entire system of government, economy, and ideology that had claimed to represent humanity's future. It vindicated democratic capitalism as the apparent victor in the great ideological contest of the 20th century. It liberated millions from authoritarian rule, while unleashing forces of change that continue to reshape our world. The story of how this concrete division came to exist, and how it dramatically fell, encapsulates the larger trajectory of the Cold War and illuminates the complex interplay of forces that drive historical transformation. The Berlin Wall was born from the ashes of World War II. After Nazi Germany's defeat in 1945, the victorious Allies divided both the country and its capital city into 4 occupation zones, controlled by the United States, Soviet Union, Great Britain, and France. As wartime cooperation gave way to Cold War antagonism, these temporary divisions hardened. By 1949, Germany had split into 2 separate states: the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, aligned with the Western democracies, and the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, established as a Soviet satellite state. Berlin, though physically located inside East German territory, retained its 4-power division. This created an anomalous situation where the eastern sectors became part of communist East Germany, while the western sectors functioned as a democratic enclave connected to West Germany by carefully negotiated access routes. More problematically for the East German regime, it meant that their citizens could simply walk into West Berlin and from there fly to West Germany. By 1961, this geographic quirk had become an existential threat to East Germany's stability. Between 1949 and 1961, approximately 2.7 million East Germans, many of them young, educated professionals, had fled to the West, creating both a demographic crisis and an ideological embarrassment. The supposed workers' paradise was being emptied of workers voting with their feet for capitalism. In the early morning hours of August 13, 1961, East German authorities closed the border and began construction of the barrier that would become the Berlin Wall. Initially consisting of barbed wire and basic fencing, it evolved into an elaborate system of concrete walls, guard towers, dog runs, anti-vehicle trenches, and a death strip, where guards had orders to shoot escapees. The wall ultimately stretched 96 miles around West Berlin, physically cementing the division of the city, the country, and symbolically, the entire Cold War world. For the next 28 years, the wall stood as the most visible emblem of the Iron Curtain that Winston Churchill had famously described as stretching from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic. It represented the fundamental lack of freedom in communist systems, societies that had to imprison their populations to prevent mass exodus. Western leaders from John F. Kennedy to Ronald Reagan used the wall as a potent symbol in Cold War rhetoric. Kennedy declared, "Ich bin ein Berliner," in solidarity with the city's Western residents in 1963, while Reagan memorably challenged Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev to tear down this wall in 1987. For East Germans, the wall's existence meant separation from family members, limited travel opportunities, and constant reminder of their unfreedom. At least 140 people died trying to cross it, shot by border guards, drowned in the Spree River, or killed in desperate escape attempts, using tunnels, homemade balloons, or rammed vehicles. Countless others were imprisoned for attempting escape or assisting others. Yet by the late 1980s, cracks were appearing in the communist system throughout Eastern Europe. Economic stagnation, technological backwardness, and inability to provide consumer goods had undermined communist regimes' legitimacy. Environmental degradation and human rights abuses had fostered growing dissent. Most importantly, Mikhail Gorbachev's ascension to power in the Soviet Union in 1985 had introduced new policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, that weakened the ideological foundations of one-party rule. Crucially, Gorbachev had also abandoned the Brezhnev Doctrine that had justified Soviet military intervention to preserve communist rule in Eastern Europe. His tacit message to satellite states was that they would need to address their own internal problems without Soviet tanks. This emboldened reform movements and undercut hardliners who had relied on the threat of Soviet intervention to maintain control. Poland led the way with the rise of the Solidarity trade union movement, which forced partially free elections in June 1989 that produced Eastern Europe's first non-communist government. Since the 1940s, Hungary began dismantling its section of the Iron Curtain along the Austrian border, creating a literal hole in the barrier that had divided East from West. When Hungary officially opened its border with Austria in September 1989, thousands of East Germans began escaping to the West through this new route, traveling to Hungary as tourists and then crossing into Austria. Inside East Germany, mass protests began in Leipzig, in September 1989, with Monday demonstrations attracting growing numbers of participants, calling for freedom to travel and democratic reforms. The regime initially planned a violent crackdown, but local officials refused to implement it without clear authorization from above. The restraint shown in Leipzig encouraged protests to spread to other cities, including East Berlin. The East German leadership, aging and rigid, found itself paralyzed between hardliners who wanted to crush dissent and reformers who recognized the need for change. Erich Honecker, who had led East Germany since 1971, was forced from power in mid-October, replaced by the slightly more moderate Egon Krenz. The new leadership desperately sought ways to release pressure without surrendering control, which led to the fateful November 9th press conference and Schabowski's momentous miscommunication. The hours following Schabowski's announcement revealed a fundamental truth about political power. It ultimately depends on the consent, or at least compliance, of the governed. Once East Germans by the thousands began acting as if the wall no longer restricted them, and once border guards chose not to use violence to maintain the old order, the system collapsed with astonishing speed. Over the following days and weeks, the wall ceased to function as a barrier. East Germans poured into West Berlin and West Germany, many just to visit and return, others to stay. Wall peckers began systematically dismantling the concrete structure with hammers and chisels, taking pieces as souvenirs of a dying era. Official demolition began the following year and continued until 1992, leaving only small sections preserved as historical monuments. The political consequences were equally swift and dramatic. The opening of the wall fatally undermined the East German regime's remaining authority. Free elections in March 1990 brought victory for parties favoring rapid reunification with West Germany. On October 3, 1990, less than 11 months after the wall's opening, the German Democratic Republic ceased to exist, its territory and people absorbed into the Federal Republic of Germany. Throughout Eastern Europe, the wall's fall accelerated processes already underway. Czechoslovakia's Velvet Revolution ousted communist rule within weeks. Bulgaria and Romania followed, the latter experiencing the only violent overthrow with the execution of dictator Nicolae Ceausescu and his wife on Christmas Day 1989. By the end of 1989, communist rule had effectively ended throughout the region, with varying degrees of violence, but with a speed and completeness that shocked even the most optimistic observers. The Soviet Union itself survived barely 2 more years. After a failed hardliner coup in August 1991, the USSR officially dissolved on December 26, 1991. The Cold War ending not with the long-feared nuclear exchange, but with the signing of legal documents. The bipolar world order that had structured international relations for nearly half a century gave way to a brief, unipolar moment of unchallenged American power. The fall of the Berlin Wall and subsequent collapse of communist regimes was initially greeted with almost universal euphoria in the West. Political scientist Francis Fukuyama famously suggested we were witnessing the end of history, the final triumph of liberal democratic capitalism as humanity's ultimate form of government. A new era of peace, prosperity, and democratization seemed at hand, with centrally planned economies and authoritarian political systems thoroughly discredited. Reality proved more complex. The transition from communism to capitalism brought severe economic hardship to many former Eastern Bloc countries. Rapid privatization created opportunities for corruption and allowed former regime insiders to convert political power into economic wealth. nationalist and ethnic tensions, previously suppressed under communist rule, re-emerged with devastating consequences in Yugoslavia and parts of the former Soviet Union. Germany's reunification, while ultimately successful, revealed the enormous challenges of merging two societies that had developed different economies, legal systems, and social values over 4 decades of separation. Despite massive transfers of wealth from west to east, estimated at over 2 trillion euros since 1990, Eastern Germany continues to lag economically, with higher unemployment and lower productivity. This economic disparity has contributed to political divisions, with far-right and far-left parties finding stronger support in the former East. More broadly, the post-war world has not fulfilled the most optimistic predictions of universal democratization and perpetual peace. Russia evolved not into a Western-style democracy, but into an authoritarian system under Vladimir Putin, who has described the Soviet Union's collapse as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. China maintained Communist Party rule while embracing market economics, creating a hybrid system that challenges Western assumptions about the necessary connection between capitalism and democracy. Yet despite these complications, the fall of the Berlin Wall remains a watershed moment that fundamentally altered the trajectory of recent history. It demonstrated the power of ordinary citizens to drive extraordinary change when seemingly immovable structures of power suddenly reveal their fragility. It vindicated the human desire for freedom of movement, expression, and self-determination. It opened possibilities for European integration that had previously seemed utopian, eventually expanding the European Union to include former communist states. For those who lived through it, the wall's fall provided one of history's rare moments of unalloyed hope, a time when peaceful protest overcame entrenched power, when the seemingly impossible happened almost overnight, when a structure designed to divide instead became a platform for unity. The iconic images of Berliners from both sides embracing atop the wall, of guards laying down their weapons rather than firing on their compatriots, of ordinary citizens using simple tools to dismantle the imposing barrier, piece by piece. These remain powerful reminders that history's course is not inevitable, but shaped by human choices and actions. Today, few physical traces of the wall remain in Berlin. Memorial markers trace its former path through the now unified city. Museum displays help younger generations understand what once divided their country. Small preserved sections stand as reminders of a divided past that once seemed permanent, but vanished almost overnight. The fall of the Berlin Wall teaches us that systems of control that appear unshakable can collapse with unexpected speed when their legitimacy evaporates. It reminds us that ordinary people acting collectively can drive extraordinary historical change, and it warns us that the outcomes of such transformative moments are rarely as simple or as uniformly positive as they first appear. In its construction, its long shadow over Cold War politics, and its dramatic fall, the Berlin Wall embodies both the human capacity to divide and the human longing to unite, conflicting tendencies that continue to shape our world long after the concrete barriers have crumbled to dust. The Russian Revolution, 1917. The bitter Russian winter of 1917 found Petrograd, formerly St. Petersburg, in the grip of crisis. 3 years of catastrophic war against Germany had drained the nation's resources and patience. Food shortages left citizens waiting in bread lines for hours in the freezing cold. Coal supplies dwindled, leaving apartments unheated. Factory workers endured brutal conditions for starvation wages, all while the aristocracy continued their lavish lifestyles, and the Tsar's government seemed incapable of addressing mounting problems. On February 23rd, March 8th by the Western calendar, thousands of women textile workers poured into the streets of Petrograd, demanding bread and an end to the war. Their protest sparked a wave of strikes that paralyzed the capital. When troops were called to suppress the demonstrations, many refused to fire on the crowds and instead joined the uprising. Within days, the situation had spiraled beyond the government's control. On March 2nd, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated, ending the 300-year Romanov dynasty and centuries of autocratic rule in Russia. This was only the beginning. 8 months later, on the night of November 6th to 7th, armed workers, soldiers, and sailors, under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin's Bolshevik Party, seized government buildings and strategic points throughout Petrograd. They stormed the Winter Palace, arrested members of the provisional government that had replaced the Tsar, and declared the world's first socialist state. This October Revolution, named for the date in the old Russian calendar, would transform not just Russia but the entire 20th century. The Russian Revolution ranks among history's most consequential turning points. It created the Soviet Union, the world's first communist state, and eventually a superpower that would shape global politics for 7 decades. It inspired revolutionary movements across the globe, from China to Cuba to Vietnam. It generated an ideological struggle between capitalism and communism that defined international relations for generations. And it established a model of one-party authoritarian rule that would be emulated by regimes of both left and right. The seeds of revolution had been growing in Russian soil for decades. The country entered the 20th century as a study in contrasts, an enormous empire spanning 1/6 of the Earth's land surface, yet economically backward compared to Western Europe. Tsar Nicholas II ruled as an absolute monarch while other European nations had evolved toward constitutional government. Most Russians remained impoverished peasants, though rapid industrialization was creating a new urban working class in cities like Petrograd and Moscow. The 1905 revolution, sparked by Russia's humiliating defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, had forced the Tsar to make limited concessions, including the creation of the Duma, parliament, and promises of civil liberties. But Nicholas soon reverted to authoritarian rule, dissolving the Duma when it opposed him and maintaining his belief in his divine right to rule without constraint. World War I became the catalyst that finally broke the old order. Russia was ill-prepared for modern warfare. Soldiers lacked basic equipment, sometimes being sent to the front without rifles and told to pick up weapons from fallen comrades. The transportation system collapsed under wartime pressures, disrupting food supplies to cities. By 1917, over 2 million Russian soldiers had died, with millions more wounded or captured. The February Revolution that overthrew the Tsar emerged spontaneously from these conditions, with no single party directing events. Power initially fell to a provisional government composed mainly of liberal members of the Duma, led first by Prince Lvov and later by Alexander Kerensky. But this government faced a fundamental problem. It lacked a clear mandate. It had not been elected but had essentially appointed itself during the chaos of the Tsar's fall. Simultaneously, another power center emerged: the Soviets, councils of workers and soldiers' deputies. These grassroots organizations, particularly the Petrograd Soviet, exercised substantial authority and often contradicted the provisional government's directives. This situation, known as dual power, created governance paralysis at a moment when decisive action was needed. The provisional government made critical mistakes that eroded its already fragile legitimacy. Most fatefully, it continued Russia's participation in World War I, despite the population's growing war weariness. It also delayed addressing land redistribution, the central concern of Russia's peasant majority, and it postponed elections for a constituent assembly that might have provided democratic legitimacy. These missteps created an opening for Vladimir Lenin, leader of the Bolshevik faction of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. Exiled in Switzerland when the February Revolution began, Lenin returned to Russia in April with German assistance. The Germans hoped he would take Russia out of the war. Upon arrival, he electrified his followers with his April Theses, rejecting any cooperation with the provisional government and calling for immediate peace, land redistribution, and all power to the Soviets. Lenin's Bolsheviks were a minority even among revolutionary socialists. Unlike the more moderate Mensheviks, who believed Russia must pass through a capitalist phase before attempting socialism, Lenin argued that Russia could leap directly to socialist revolution if led by a disciplined vanguard party. Once a fringe position, this view gained growing support as the provisional government floundered. A failed military offensive in July, an attempted right-wing coup in August, and continuing economic deterioration further weakened the government. By autumn, the Bolsheviks had won majorities in the Petrograd and Moscow Soviets. Lenin, who had gone into hiding after a premature uprising attempt in July, now pushed his reluctant comrades toward armed insurrection. Leon Trotsky, a brilliant orator and organizer who had recently joined the Bolsheviks, played a crucial role in planning the October seizure of power as head of the Petrograd Soviet's Military Revolutionary Committee. The actual takeover was remarkably bloodless. The Winter Palace was captured with minimal resistance, as the provisional government had lost nearly all support. The morning after seizing power, Lenin announced the new government's first decrees: an immediate peace offer to all belligerent nations, the abolition of private land ownership, and workers' control of factories. The Bolsheviks, soon renamed the Communist Party, promised a utopian transformation: an end to exploitation, equality for all citizens, an eventual global revolution that would eliminate national boundaries and create a communist world order. Reality proved far messier. The fledgling Soviet government faced immediate challenges from multiple directions. Elections to the Constituent Assembly in November 1917 gave the Bolsheviks only 24% of the vote, with the peasant-based Socialist Revolutionary Party winning an absolute majority. Lenin simply dissolved the assembly by force when it met in January 1918, abandoning any pretense of pluralistic democracy. The Soviet government negotiated the harsh Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany in March 1918, surrendering vast territories to end Russia's participation in World War I. This move, though practical, further alienated many Russians. Opposition forces, loosely united as the Whites against the Bolshevik Reds, began organizing resistance, supported by foreign powers alarmed by communism's threat to the international order. The resulting civil war, 1918 to 1922, was extraordinarily brutal. The Cheka, the Bolshevik secret police established in December 1917, implemented a policy of red terror against perceived class enemies. The Whites committed their own atrocities in territories they controlled, Foreign interventions, American, British, French, and Japanese troops on Russian soil added to the conflict's complexity. Caught between competing armies, the civilian population suffered enormously from requisitioning, conscription, and outright violence. Facing these existential threats, the Soviet leadership instituted war communism, the forced requisitioning of grain from peasants, nationalization of all industry, the abolition of money in favor of direct distribution, and the militarization of labor. These extreme measures helped win the Civil War, but brought the economy to near complete collapse. By 1921, industrial production had fallen to about 20% of pre-war levels. A devastating famine in 1921 to 22 killed an estimated 5 million people. Lenin, recognizing that the regime might not survive continuing economic catastrophe, instituted the new economic policy, NEP, in 1921. This tactical retreat from pure communism restored limited market mechanisms, allowing peasants to sell surplus production after meeting tax obligations, and permitting small-scale private businesses to operate. The new economic policy successfully revived the economy, but created ideological contradictions within the evolving Soviet system. By the time Lenin died in 1924, the revolution had achieved its basic goal of establishing a communist state, but at enormous cost. The former Russian Empire had been transformed into the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, formalizing the new federation in 1922. The revolutionary dream of international proletarian revolution had failed to materialize, with communist uprisings in Germany, Hungary, and elsewhere defeated. The Soviet leadership, particularly Joseph Stalin, who emerged victorious in the power struggle following Lenin's death, increasingly focused on socialism in one country rather than world revolution. The revolution's impact extended far beyond Russia's borders. The communist model of revolution, a disciplined vanguard party seizing power in the name of the working class, would be exported worldwide, shaping revolutionary movements from China to Cuba. The establishment of the Communist International, Comintern, in 1919 created a global network of communist parties taking direction from Moscow. Fear of communist revolution prompted authoritarian countermeasures in many countries and provided justification for fascist movements claiming to be bulwarks against Bolshevism. For Russians themselves, the revolution's legacy was complex and contradictory. The Soviet system ultimately provided universal education, healthcare, housing, and employment, achievements in a country that had been predominantly illiterate and impoverished under the Tsars. Women gained legal equality, with the Soviet Union pioneering policies like paid maternity leave and state-supported child care. Minority nationalities received territorial autonomy and cultural recognition, at least nominally. Yet these advances came alongside political repression that intensified dramatically under Stalin. The one-party state eliminated all independent political activity. Religion faced persecution, with churches closed and clergy arrested. The collectivization of agriculture in the late 1920s and early 1930s led to millions of deaths, particularly in Ukraine. The Great Purge of 1936 to 38 executed hundreds of thousands, including much of the original revolutionary leadership, while sending millions to labor camps in the expanding Gulag system. This combination of modernization and repression characterized the Soviet experience until the system's collapse in 1991. The state that emerged from the Russian Revolution transformed a backward agricultural country into an industrial and military superpower that achieved remarkable scientific accomplishments, from pioneering space exploration to making important contributions in mathematics, physics, and other fields. Yet it did so through a single-party dictatorship that denied basic civil liberties and proved ultimately unsustainable. The October Revolution thus stands as one of history's most consequential, yet ambiguous turning points. It demonstrated humanity's capacity to reimagine and reconstruct society according to ideological blueprints. It helped accelerate the collapse of European colonial empires by inspiring anti-imperial movements worldwide. It forced capitalist societies to reform themselves, adopting welfare state measures partly to prevent their own workers from embracing communism. Yet the revolution also revealed the dangers of utopian political projects that sacrifice present generations for promised future perfection. The gap between communist ideals and Soviet realities became an essential tension in 20th century history. The revolution that began with dreams of human liberation created a system of control that ultimately failed to deliver either prosperity or freedom. When the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, some declared the final verdict on the Russian Revolution had been rendered. Yet its questions remain fundamentally unresolved. How can societies achieve both liberty and equality? What are the proper limits of state power in pursuing social justice? Can profound social transformation occur without violence? Is democracy possible in societies without democratic traditions? These questions, first posed dramatically in Russia in 1917, continue to haunt our political imagination. The Russian Revolution represents both an inspiring moment, when ordinary people overthrew centuries of aristocratic domination, and a cautionary tale about the human costs of attempting to create utopia through force. In this duality lies its enduring significance as one of history's great turning points, a revolution that aimed to create a new world and, for better and worse, succeeded. The digital revolution, 90s to 2000s. On a January morning in 2007, a man in a black turtleneck and jeans stood on a San Francisco stage and pulled a small rectangular device from his pocket. Today, Apple is going to reinvent the phone, Steve Jobs declared, before demonstrating a touchscreen marvel that combined a mobile phone, internet communicator, and iPod in one sleek package. The audience erupted in applause, unaware they were witnessing not just the launch of a new product, but a pivotal moment in an ongoing transformation of human society. The iPhone wasn't the beginning of the digital revolution that had been building for decades, but it represented a critical inflection point when digital technology leaped from specialized devices to becoming ubiquitous, intimate, and utterly integrated into daily life. That pocket-sized computer would accelerate changes in how humans communicate, work, shop, learn, find love, entertain themselves, and organize politically. Changes that continue to reshape our world at a pace without precedent in human history. What we call the digital revolution represents humanity's transition from analog, mechanical, and electronic technology to digital technology, a shift as profound as the agricultural revolution that began 12,000 years ago, or the industrial revolution of the 18th and 19th centuries. Like those earlier transformations, the digital revolution isn't a single event, but an accelerating process that continues to unfold, pushing humanity into uncharted territory, where the very nature of work, community, knowledge, and possibly even what it means to be human, are being radically redefined. The seeds of this revolution were planted decades before smartphones appeared in billions of pockets. In 1947, Bell Laboratories scientists invented the transistor, a tiny electronic component that could control the flow of electricity, replacing bulky vacuum tubes and enabling much smaller electronic devices. By the 1960s, multiple transistors could be integrated on single silicon chips, dramatically reducing the size and cost of computing power. The 1970s saw the development of the microprocessor, essentially an entire computer on a single chip. Intel's 4004 chip, released in 1971, contained 2,300 transistors and could execute 60,000 operations per second. By comparison, a modern smartphone processor contains billions of transistors and performs operations measured in trillions per second. This exponential growth in computing power, observed by Intel co-founder Gordon Moore and known as Moore's Law, has driven digital development for 5 decades. Personal computers emerged in the late 1970s and 1980s, bringing digital technology from government and corporate environments into homes and small businesses. Apple's 1984 Macintosh introduced the graphical user interface and mouse that made computers accessible to non-specialists. Microsoft's Windows operating system would later bring similar functionality to the IBM PC platform that dominated the business world. The 1990s saw 2 developments that would prove revolutionary. First, the Internet, previously a network used primarily by academic and government researchers, opened to commercial use and began rapid expansion. Second, Tim Berners-Lee invented the World Wide Web, a system of interlinked hypertext documents accessed via the Internet that made digital information dramatically more accessible through browsers like Netscape Navigator and later Internet Explorer. By the turn of the millennium, mobile phones had become commonplace in developed countries, though primarily for voice calls and later text messages. Digital cameras began replacing film. MP3 players like the iPod changed how people consumed music. E-commerce pioneers like Amazon and eBay established online shopping. Search engines, particularly Google, created new ways to find information. Early social networks like Friendster and MySpace connected people online. But it was the convergence of these technologies, mobile connectivity, digital media, internet access, and social platforms into smartphones and later tablets that truly embedded digital technology into every aspect of daily life. The iPhone's launch was followed by Google's Android operating system, creating a competitive ecosystem that drove rapid innovation and global adoption. The 2010s saw digital technology become truly ubiquitous. By 2023, over 6.8 billion people, 85% of the global population, owned a smartphone, making it possibly the most rapidly adopted technology in human history. Social media platforms like Facebook, now Meta, Twitter, now X, Instagram, and later TikTok, became central to social interaction, news consumption, and cultural expression. Cloud computing moved data and processing from local devices to vast server farms, enabling new services and business models. Artificial intelligence, particularly machine learning systems trained on massive data sets, began transforming everything from image recognition to language translation. The Internet of Things connected everyday objects, thermostats, refrigerators, cars, industrial equipment, to digital networks. Cryptocurrencies proposed new forms of decentralized finance. Virtual and augmented reality technologies began offering new ways to experience digital content. The economic impact of this transformation has been staggering. 5 of the world's most valuable companies, Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Alphabet, Google's parent, and Meta, are primarily digital technology firms. Traditional industries have been upended by digital competitors. Airbnb in hospitality, Uber in transportation, Netflix in entertainment, Spotify in music. Entire sectors like retail, banking, publishing, and advertising have been forced to reinvent themselves for the digital age. Digital technologies have created entirely new forms of work. Software development, web design, digital marketing, content creation, and data science offer high-paying careers that didn't exist a generation ago. The gig economy, facilitated by digital platforms connecting workers with customers, has created flexible but often precarious employment for millions. Remote work, accelerated dramatically by the COVID-19 pandemic, has untethered many jobs from physical locations, reorganizing where and how people live. Simultaneously, digital automation has eliminated many traditional jobs and threatens others. Factory robots replace manufacturing workers. Self-checkout stations reduce cashier positions. Algorithms perform tasks once done by stock traders, insurance underwriters, and legal assistants. Artificial intelligence increasingly threatens knowledge work previously considered safe from automation. These disruptions have contributed to growing inequality, with benefits flowing disproportionately to those with high-level digital skills and owners of technology platforms. Beyond economics, the digital revolution has transformed how humans interact and form communities. Social media platforms connect people with shared interests across vast distances, creating novel forms of identity and belonging. Diaspora communities maintain ties despite geographic separation. Political and social movements organize online, from the Arab Spring to the hashtag #MeToo to climate activism. Gaming communities develop their own cultures and economies. Yet these new forms of connection coincide with decreasing in-person interaction and growing concerns about social isolation. Studies link heavy social media use, particularly among young people, to increased anxiety, depression, and body image issues. Political polarization has been amplified by algorithmic content that often reinforces existing beliefs and outrage-driven engagement models. The traditional institutions that once structured community life, religious organizations, civic groups, local media, have been weakened by competition from digital alternatives. The digital revolution has democratized access to information and creative tools. Wikipedia offers a free encyclopedia in hundreds of languages. YouTube hosts instructional videos on virtually any skill. Billions of people carry devices capable of creating professional quality photographs, videos, and audio recordings. Self-publishing platforms enable authors to reach audiences without traditional gatekeepers. Open-source software provides powerful tools available to anyone with internet access. Simultaneously, the flood of unfiltered information has created new challenges. Misinformation spreads rapidly through social networks, sometimes deliberately propagated by malicious actors. Conspiracy theories find fertile ground in algorithmic recommendation systems that prioritize engagement over accuracy. Deep fakes, synthetic media created by AI, increasingly blur the line between reality and fiction. Digital literacy has become essential but remains unevenly distributed. Privacy has been fundamentally redefined in the digital age. Tech platforms collect unprecedented amounts of personal data: location, communications, shopping habits, health information, social connections, often with minimal transparency or user control. This data powers both personalized services and targeted advertising. Government surveillance capabilities have expanded dramatically. raising civil liberties concerns. Data breaches expose sensitive information to criminals. The digital revolution has been global, but uneven. While mobile internet has reached much of the developing world, a significant digital divide persists in access, quality, cost, and skills. Urban areas typically have better connectivity than rural regions. Gender gaps in digital access and literacy remain substantial in many countries. Disabilities can limit interaction with devices not designed for universal accessibility. These disparities risk amplifying existing inequalities in economic opportunity and political voice. Simultaneously, the flood of unfiltered information has created new challenges. Misinformation spreads rapidly through social networks, sometimes deliberately propagated by malicious actors. Conspiracy theories find fertile ground in algorithmic recommendation systems that prioritize engagement over accuracy. Deep fakes, synthetic media created by AI, increasingly blur the line between reality and fiction. Digital literacy has become essential, but remains unevenly distributed. Privacy has been fundamentally redefined in the digital age. Tech platforms collect unprecedented amounts of personal data: location, communications, shopping habits, health information, social connections, often with minimal transparency or user control. This data powers both personalized services and targeted advertising. Government surveillance capabilities have expanded dramatically, raising civil liberties concerns. Data breaches expose sensitive information to criminals. The digital revolution has been global, but uneven. While mobile internet has reached much of the developing world, a significant digital divide persists in access, quality, cost, and skills. Urban areas typically have better connectivity than rural regions. Gender gaps in digital access and literacy remain substantial in many countries. Disabilities can limit interaction with devices not designed for universal accessibility. These disparities risk amplifying existing inequalities in economic opportunity and political voice. Environmentally, digital technology presents complex trade-offs. Remote work and teleconferencing can reduce transportation emissions. Digital documents save paper. Smart systems optimize energy usage in buildings and industrial processes. Yet manufacturing electronics requires rare earth minerals often mined under problematic conditions. Data centers consume substantial electricity. Rapid product cycles generate electronic waste. Cryptocurrency mining has become a significant energy drain. Perhaps most profoundly, the digital revolution has begun changing humanity's relationship with knowledge itself. Memory becomes less about storing information internally and more about knowing how to retrieve it externally. Attention is fragmented by constant notifications and novel content. Reading habits shift from deep engagement with long texts to skimming multiple shorter works. Boundaries blur between work and leisure, public and private, present and distant. Artificial intelligence represents the digital revolution's next frontier, with systems like GPT-4 and other large language models demonstrating capabilities that approach or sometimes exceed human performance across various domains. These technologies promise tremendous benefits, accelerating scientific research, personalizing education, improving healthcare diagnostics, increasing productivity across industries, while raising profound questions about labor displacement, algorithmic bias, intellectual property, privacy, and ultimately humanity's role in a world of increasingly capable machines. Looking ahead, emerging technologies like brain-computer interfaces, quantum computing, advanced robotics, and biotechnology enhanced by AI will likely accelerate the pace of change, creating possibilities both exhilarating and disquieting. The convergence of digital and biological technologies may eventually challenge fundamental categories that have defined human experience. The digital revolution differs from previous transformative periods in three critical ways. First, its pace is unprecedented. The interval between invention and mass adoption has compressed from decades to years, or even months. Second, it's truly global, connecting previously isolated regions into a single information ecosystem. Third, it increasingly involves technologies that can improve themselves through machine learning, potentially accelerating beyond human control or comprehension. This revolution has already altered power structures at every level. Technology platforms exercise influence comparable to nation-states, traditional centers of authority. Governments, established media, educational institutions, religious organizations find their roles challenged by digital alternatives. Individual creators can reach audiences of millions without institutional backing. Authoritarian regimes leverage digital surveillance while facing new forms of opposition, organized through encrypted messaging. The 20th century organized human societies primarily around competing economic and political ideologies: capitalism versus communism, democracy versus authoritarianism. The 21st century increasingly organizes around digital capabilities and governance models. Who controls the technology, data, and algorithms that mediate modern life? And toward what ends? From the introduction of written language to the printing press to radio and television, communication technologies have always shaped human societies. The digital revolution represents a step change in this process. Not just a new medium, but a fundamental reorganization of how information is created, distributed, stored, and processed. We've moved from scarce, centralized information to abundant, networked information, with profound consequences for everything from commerce to governance to personal identity. That sleek device Steve Jobs unveiled in 2007 was not merely a clever combination of existing technologies, but a portal to a new way of being human, constantly connected, infinitely distracted, globally networked, algorithmically influenced, and increasingly dependent on systems whose complexity exceeds individual understanding. The smartphone in your pocket represents a more dramatic change in human capability than the tools our ancient ancestors first carried as they ventured out of Africa. We are still in the early stages of this transformation. Just as those living through the early Industrial Revolution could not have imagined highways filled with automobiles or cities defined by skyscrapers, we cannot fully envision how digital technology will reshape society in the decades ahead. What's certain is that the revolution that began with room-sized computers and accelerated through personal computers, the internet, mobile devices, and now artificial intelligence, has already altered fundamental aspects of human existence and will continue to do so at an accelerating pace. The digital revolution represents humanity's latest great leap into the unknown, a testament to our species' ingenuity, our desire for connection, and our ceaseless drive to extend our capabilities beyond biological limitations. Whether this revolution ultimately enhances human flourishing or undermines it depends not on the technology itself, but on the wisdom, foresight, and values we bring to shaping its continued development. The Italian Alpine War, fighting at 10,000 feet. the Italian soldier huddled in his makeshift shelter, carved into the ice, his breath forming crystalline clouds in the bitter Alpine air. At an elevation exceeding 10,000 feet, he could see the enemy Austrian positions just a few hundred yards away, across a narrow valley. For nearly 2 years, both armies had clung to these impossible peaks, enduring not just enemy fire, but temperatures that plunged to 40 degrees below 00, avalanches that could wipe out entire companies in seconds, and winds that howled through the mountains with enough force to hurl men from their positions. This was the Italian front of World War I, a forgotten theater where men fought not only against each other but against nature itself in some of the most extreme conditions ever faced in warfare. While the Western Front's muddy trenches have dominated our collective memory of the Great War, the conflict in the Alps represented an entirely different kind of hell, a vertical war of unprecedented difficulty fought along a 400-mile front, stretching from the Swiss border to the Adriatic Sea. Here, in what Italians called the White War, Guerra Bianca, soldiers battled along jagged ridgelines, on glacier fields, and through mountain passes where military operations had previously been considered impossible. They hauled artillery pieces to summits that only the most experienced mountaineers had ever reached. They built elaborate tunnel systems and barracks inside the mountains themselves. They developed specialized equipment and tactics for winter warfare, and they died, hundreds of thousands of them, not just from bullets and shells, but from exposure, altitude sickness, and the crushing force of avalanches deliberately triggered as weapons. Italy's entry into World War I came nearly a year after the conflict began. Though nominally allied with Germany and Austria-Hungary in the Triple Alliance, Italy declared neutrality when war erupted in August 1914. For months, both sides courted Italy's favor, but ultimately the Allies made the more attractive offer. The Secret Treaty of London, signed in April 1915, promised Italy significant territorial gains at Austria-Hungary's expense. The Trentino and South Tyrol regions, Trieste, Istria, parts of Dalmatia, and influence in Albania. On May 23, 1915, Italy declared war on Austria-Hungary, though not on Germany until the following year. Italian nationalists celebrated what they called their Fourth War of Independence, believing it would complete the Risorgimento, Italy's unification movement, by bringing unredeemed Italian-speaking territories under the flag. Few imagined the scale of sacrifice this decision would entail. Italy's commander-in-chief, General Luigi Cadorna, faced an immense geographic challenge. The border with Austria-Hungary ran through some of Europe's most forbidding terrain, the Alps and Dolomites in the north, and the Karst Plateau in the east. Only along the Isonzo River in the southeast did the topography appear somewhat favorable for offensive operations, and even this sector featured rugged mountainous ground. The Austrian commander, Field Marshal Franz Conrad von Hötzendorf, had anticipated Italy's betrayal and prepared accordingly. Despite being heavily engaged against Russia on the Eastern Front, he had positioned 100,000 troops along the Italian border, occupying dominant heights and fortified positions. Though outnumbered by the Italian army's 875,000 men, the Austrians held nearly every geographical advantage. Cadorna chose to focus his main effort along the Isonzo River, aiming to break through to Trieste and the Ljubljana Gap, which would open a pathway to Vienna. Between June 1915 and September 1917, he would launch 11 separate offensives in this sector, the 11 battles of the Isonzo, gaining minimal ground at staggering cost. Each side would suffer approximately 500,000 casualties along this river before the campaign's conclusion. But it was in the Alpine sector where the war reached its most extreme and surreal dimensions. Here, traditional military doctrine proved useless against both the enemy and the environment. Troops, specially selected for mountain warfare, the Italian Alpini, with their distinctive feathered hats, and the Austrian Kaiser Jäger and Landesschützen, led the fighting, bringing specialized skills in climbing, skiing, and surviving at high altitudes. Establishing front lines at unprecedented elevations required extraordinary engineering efforts. Mule tracks and then aerial cableways teleferica were constructed to transport supplies equipment and reinforcements to positions previously accessible only to experienced mountaineers. Some cableways stretched over 6,000 feet in length, with differences in elevation exceeding 3,000 feet. Where animal transport failed, human porters, including women and children from local villages, carried supplies up narrow mountain trails, sometimes making multiple ascent-descent cycles daily, with loads exceeding 90 pounds. The soldiers' existence in this vertical world defied imagination. On the Adamilo Glacier, at elevations approaching 12,000 feet, troops built entire barracks within the ice, creating tunnels and chambers that provided some protection from the elements and enemy fire. On Monte Cristallo in the Dolomites, Austrians and Italians fought literally on the vertical, with troops suspended on ropes along cliff faces as they attempted to outflank enemy positions above or below them. The environmental threats often exceeded the danger from enemy action. Winter temperatures at high elevations regularly reached -40 degrees, causing thousands of cases of frostbite and hypothermia. Avalanches proved deadlier than artillery on many occasions. The winter of 1916 to 1917 was particularly catastrophic, with some 10,000 soldiers killed by avalanches in what became known as White Friday, December 13th, 1916, when heavy snowfall followed by warming temperatures created perfect conditions for disaster. Beyond avalanches, rockfalls, crevasses, and blizzards claimed countless lives. Many wounded men stranded in exposed positions simply froze to death before they could be evacuated. Medical evacuation often involved hours-long journeys by stretcher down treacherous mountain paths or via improvised sleds over snowfields. Combat surgeons operated in cave hospitals with limited supplies and under constant threat from artillery or mountain hazards. Both sides soon weaponized the environment itself. Artillery was precisely calibrated to trigger avalanches onto enemy positions. Tunnels were dug through mountains to emerge behind enemy lines, or, in some cases, directly beneath them. On the Marmolada Glacier, Italian engineers created the City of Ice, a complex of tunnels and chambers extending for kilometers within the glacier, housing up to 300 troops, invisible to Austrian observers and protected from artillery fire. The most spectacular example of mountain warfare innovation came with the mines detonated beneath enemy positions. Unable to break through Austrian defenses on key mountain peaks through frontal assault, Italian engineers began digging tunnels hundreds of meters through solid rock to place massive explosive charges beneath enemy fortifications. On March 18, 1916, they detonated 5 tons of explosives beneath Austrian positions on Col di Lana, collapsing a portion of the mountain and killing hundreds of defenders instantly. The Austrians adopted the same tactics. Their greatest mining success came on June 7, 1917, when they detonated 78,000 pounds of explosives beneath Italian positions on Mount Simone, killing 120 Italian soldiers and leaving a crater that remains visible today. The blast was so powerful, it was heard 60 miles away in Venice. Beyond the tactical innovations, the Alpine War demanded technological adaptation at an unprecedented rate. Both sides developed specialized winter equipment, white camouflage uniforms, more effective climbing gear, cold weather shelters, and improved skis. Artillery was modified for high-angle fire in mountain terrain and disassembled into man-portable loads for transport to seemingly inaccessible positions. Some guns were even mounted on sleds for mobility over snow. Despite these innovations, the front remained largely static through 1915 and 1916. Cadorna's repeated offensives along the Isonzo gained minimal ground at enormous cost. The Austrians, fighting a multi-front war against Russia, Serbia, and Italy, maintained a primarily defensive posture, but launched local counterattacks when opportunities presented themselves. By 1917, the strategic situation had evolved. Russia's internal problems following the February Revolution reduced pressure on Austria-Hungary's Eastern Front, allowing for reinforcement of the Italian theater. Simultaneously, Germany, concerned about its allies' ability to continue fighting, committed to direct intervention against Italy. The result was the Battle of Caporetto, now Kobarid in Slovenia, beginning on October 24, 1917. Using infiltration tactics, poison gas, and overwhelming artillery support, combined Austro-German forces achieved a stunning breakthrough of Italian lines. The Italian Second Army collapsed, with over 300,000 men captured, and the remainder retreating in disarray. By mid-November, the Italians had been pushed back nearly 100 miles to the Piave River, where they finally established a new defensive line. Caporetto represented not just a military disaster, but a national trauma for Italy. Cadorna was replaced by General Armando Diaz, who rebuilt the shattered army with a more humane leadership style. Allied reinforcements, 6 French and 5 British divisions, bolstered the front. The remaining Italian forces, fighting now to defend their homeland rather than conquer Austrian territory, found new resolve. Through the winter of 1917 to 1918 and into the spring, the reinvigorated Italian army repelled Austrian attempts to break through the Piave line. In June 1918, the Austrians launched their final offensive, crossing the Piave with 58 divisions, but failing to consolidate their gains. By this point, the Habsburg Empire was unraveling internally, with food shortages, political unrest, and growing nationalist movements among its constituent peoples. The final Italian offensive began on October 24, 1918, exactly 1 year after Caporetto. At the Battle of Vittorio Veneto, Italian forces crossed the Piave and rapidly broke through Austrian lines. As the Habsburg forces disintegrated, with many non-German units refusing to continue fighting, the Italians advanced rapidly. Austria-Hungary requested an armistice on November 3rd, effectively ending the war on the Italian front. The human cost had been staggering. Italy suffered approximately 650,000 military deaths and over 1 million wounded from its 3.5 years of war. Austria-Hungary lost around 400,000 dead and 1.2 million wounded in the Italian theater alone. Civilian casualties in the war zone added tens of thousands more to the toll. Entire mountain villages were destroyed by artillery fire, or as a matter of military policy to deny their use to the enemy. The environmental impact was similarly profound. Forests were decimated for construction, firewood, and to clear fields of fire. Mountainsides were literally reshaped by tunneling, mining, and artillery bombardment. Wildlife disappeared from combat zones. Unexploded ordnance would continue claiming lives for decades after the war's end. In the peace settlement, Italy received most of the territories promised in the Treaty of London: the Trentino, South Tyrol, Trieste, and Istria. However, Italian nationalists felt cheated of other promised lands, particularly in Dalmatia, which largely went to the newly formed kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, later Yugoslavia. This sense of a mutilated victory, Vittoria Mutilata, fed political instability that contributed to Benito Mussolini's rise to power in 1922. For the defeated Austro-Hungarian Empire, the war's end brought total dissolution. The dual monarchy collapsed into its constituent nationalities, with new independent states, Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia, emerging from its territory, along with territories annexed by Romania, Poland, and Italy. The multi-ethnic empire that had dominated Central Europe for centuries ceased to exist. Beyond the geopolitical consequences, the Alpine War left lasting legacies in military affairs. Mountain warfare techniques developed during these campaigns influenced military doctrine worldwide. The specialized mountain troops of both sides, particularly the Italian Alpini, earned reputations for exceptional toughness and skill that endure to this day. Equipment innovations in cold weather warfare would be further refined and employed in World War II and beyond. The physical remnants of this vertical war remain strikingly visible a century later. Trenches, tunnels, barracks, and artillery positions still scar the Alpine landscape. Rusted weapons, ammunition, and equipment continue to emerge from melting glaciers, a phenomenon accelerated by climate change. War museums throughout the region display artifacts and preserve the memory of this extraordinary conflict. Perhaps most poignantly, the retreating glaciers occasionally reveal the remains of soldiers who disappeared during the fighting, preserved in ice for over a century. These discoveries, often with personal effects, letters, and identification still intact, provide a direct human connection to a conflict otherwise fading from living memory. The Alpine War represents one of history's most extreme examples of humans pushing beyond seemingly insurmountable environmental limitations to continue killing each other. It demonstrates both the ingenuity and the folly of warfare, the extraordinary technical achievements that allowed combat at such elevations, and the senseless destruction that resulted from their application. Today, hiking trails trace former front lines through some of Europe's most beautiful mountain landscapes. Memorial chapels and monuments dot remote peaks where thousands died. Military cemeteries with their endless rows of crosses testify to the scale of sacrifice. The contrast between the natural beauty of the Alps and the bitter struggle once waged there offers a powerful reminder of war's incongruity with the environments it consumes. The soldiers who fought the White War, whether Italian Alpini in their feathered caps or Austrian Kaiserjäger with their Edelweiss insignia, battled not just each other but the very limits of human endurance. They established front lines at elevations where sustained human habitation was previously considered impossible. They survived winters that would have killed unprepared troops within hours. They transformed pristine mountain wilderness into industrialized killing grounds. Their story of courage, suffering, innovation, and endurance in conditions that defy imagination deserves to be remembered as one of the most extraordinary chapters of the Great War. While the mud of Flanders and the bloodbath of the Somme have come to define our image of World War I, the men who fought and died among the eternal snows of the Alps wrote a different, no less important chapter in the history of human conflict. A vertical war whose true scale and difficulty remained, until recently, among the forgotten fronts of a global catastrophe.